The dining hall glows under morning light, a feast spread across the long table for a celebration. Servants carry dishes in and praise young Master Isaac, who has just earned a recommendation to enter the Royal Academy at only 10 years old. The nanny brings out a tray filled with his favorite foods, calling it a joyous day worth celebrating. Isaac, 10 years old, thanks her with a warm smile, sitting proudly at the head of the table in his fine suit. A servant named Hans steps forward with a wrapped gift, insisting Isaac accept it despite his protest that it isn't necessary. Hans explains that his own son survived an illness because of medicine Isaac once brought him. Isaac calls the gift nothing compared to that debt, and accepts it gladly. Thanking Hans by name, a young boy comes running through the hall, calling out for his brother. The boy, holding a lute, announces he'll play a song to celebrate the occasion. Another servant praises the boy Jonas, noting that even the court musicians called him a prodigy. Isaac smiles and asks to hear the song for himself. Jonas nods eagerly, ready to perform. He begins strumming the lute with focus and joy. Suddenly, the scene shatters into darkness, screams and Jonas's name echoing through the chaos. A grown man wakes with a jolt, sweat on his face, eyes wide with dread. Gasping in a dark room, he sits beside a bed, murmuring that it was only a dream. His expression turns cold and sharp, muttering to himself how foolish it all was alone in a snow-covered courtyard. He admits he can never return to those days. Footsteps echo down worn stone stairs as he moves deeper into a quiet, aged building. A servant greets him warmly as young Master Isaac, bringing him a simple meal by lantern light, marking his return to a place from the past he once knew. Isaac wakes with a start, confusion crossing his face in the dim chamber. Lucas approaches with food and a lantern, asking if he'd had a nightmare, noting how pale he looks. Isaac rubs his forehead, admitting he dreamt of the past, and when asked how far back, answers about 20 years. Lucas sets down the tray, brushing off the heavy memories and offering fresh cheese instead of dwelling on old times. The meal sits before him, stew and bread and cheese, while Lucas reminds him that sword training awaits once he finishes eating. Isaac stares at the food in silence, his thoughts drifting back to that time 20 years ago, when he was 10 and a month from entering the Royal Academy, struck suddenly by a flu. The illness dragged on for 3 months without improvement, prompting his father, Count Goethe, to summon a scholar from the magic tower. The hooded scholar sits across from the Count, questioning him about a special constitution mentioned earlier. The scholar explains that every living being carries an innate mana vessel through which mana flows at a pace matched to its size, but the boy's circulation defies that balance entirely, moving with a speed and violence beyond understanding. The scholar delivers the verdict plainly: his vessel will eventually shatter. The Count collapses onto the sofa, gripping his head as shattered porcelain lies scattered on the floor. The truth he had tried to deny now closing in. The mana within the boy's body bursts forward like a broken dam, surging out to meet the mana around him. His face twists in anguish as the collision ignites into a full mana explosion. The blast tears through the room, flinging furniture and light in every direction as another figure recoils in shock nearby. In the aftermath, a bloodied hand lies still against the floor beside a fallen blade. The explosions did not stop there. They would quiet for a time only to erupt again, without warning, filling the mansion with dread. The worst came when the surge tore through his younger brother's right hand, leaving the boy broken with guilt. Trembling, he begs to be locked away, unable to bear the danger he poses to those around him. Alone in isolation, tears fall silently down his face, in a place where no one could reach him and where no one could be heard again. A sudden cough breaks the silence, blood catching in his throat as tears blur his vision. He reaches out weakly, calling Lucas's name into the empty dark. Blood stains his palm, and Lucas's voice rings out in alarm, recognizing the symptoms of mana poisoning brought on by staying too close for too long. Lucas presses a cloth to the wound, insisting Isaac needs at least a month of rest after lingering by his side when he didn't have to. Isaac laughs it off weakly, asking who else would attend to him if not Lucas, since he has no other friends. Lucas fires back, half joking, asking if he wants to be thrown out for the insult. Isaac brushes off the worry, telling him not to fret, since after all, he hasn't lost a single hair, despite causing dozens of explosions. Lucas warns him plainly that no one else could replace him, and a single mistake could cost Isaac everything. Isaac waves him off, telling him to leave so he can meditate undisturbed. Time shifts forward, Isaac's expression calm as he reflects on how long it had truly been. A quiet door stands closed in the dim corridor, sealing away the past behind it. A voice rings out again, congratulating young Master Isaac. the scene shifting into memory once more. Isaac sits composed at the head of a long table, older now, wearing the calm authority of adulthood, but the table is soaked in blood, bodies scattered among the shattered dinnerware, as violence erupts through the once joyous hall. A cloaked figure lies collapsed nearby as a voice greets, someone arriving late to the massacre. Lucas is welcomed back with a chilling smile, his eye catching the light amid the carnage. He stands over the ruined table, addressing someone with quiet menace beneath the blood-stained ceiling. A twisted smile spreads across his face as he tells his young master it has been a long while. Isaac gasps awake, torn from the nightmare, his eyes wide with dread. He whispers brokenly that Lucas died, remembering how Lucas left coughing up blood and never visited again for over a year, the news of his death reaching him only faintly through his father, and how that same day another mana explosion struck, leading him to seal his door completely. A piece of bread crumbles softly on the tray, resting untouched under the dim light. Isaac lies in bed, thinking he should have kept his distance from those he'd let close. He tells himself he shouldn't have gotten attached, that he should have stayed colder from the start. A memory surfaces of his family, warm and smiling, the thought trailing off unfinished. More years pass in the underground chamber, bread piling higher and higher with each passing season. A hand reaches for one loaf among the pile, a quiet reminder that he is still alive. He resolves to keep looking forward instead of dwelling on the past. The young man grows middle-aged in isolation, though his face already carries the weight of someone much older. Over more than 30 years underground, he pours himself into studying magic to overcome his broken constitution, until the books offer nothing new to learn. With nothing left to study, only instinct and inspiration remain to guide him forward. A bearded stranger's voice echoes through his mind, addressing him as one who begins a journey. The voice calls him profoundly lonely, asking if he can stand alone before infinity in a world where only mana and he exist, urging him to awaken to himself. Several more years pass, and at last, he finds a clue to overcoming his condition. He eats absently, wondering if there is a problem within the family, his mind consumed by the research piling up around him. A magic circle and crystals rest on the desk, his sharp eyes catching something significant in them. He notes he must be 71, now counting the tally marks etched across the wall behind him. Footsteps sound as he steps toward the door of his chamber, his aged face set with quiet purpose. A voice from outside calls out, uncertain, asking if it is his brother. The voice identifies itself as Jonas, asking if he is asleep. Isaac steps forward, calling Jonas's name, asking what could have brought him here after all this time. A silhouette lingers by the door, the room quiet and dark around him. Startled, Isaac asks if he may come in, his weathered face full of hesitation. A hand rises firmly, cutting him off, telling him to speak from where he stands. Instead, Jonas settles down against the door, outside, asking how Isaac has been all this time, only to receive a quiet answer, that it is a long story. Jonas asks if he knows what day it is, revealing it is the anniversary of their father's death. Isaac, stunned, asks how their father passed away. Jonas offers to tell the long story if Isaac is willing to listen. He begins from 30 years ago, starting with the succession war between the first and second princes. His voice fades into illegible murmurs as the memory blurs, Isaac listening intently from behind the door. The illegible words continue, Isaac's expression darkening as the story unfolds further. Isaac sits alone afterward, admitting he lost track of time, telling Jonas he has to admit one thing: he has a real talent for storytelling. Jonas laughs it off, joking that if he'd known, he should have wandered the world and lived as a poet instead. He adds, almost lightly, that it might have been difficult since he can only use one hand now. Isaac, from the shadows, quietly apologizes. Silence follows, hands clenched, before Jonas speaks again, saying, "You know what?" He tells Isaac that their father, their mother, and even he himself had hated him deeply. Brother Jonas's expression tightens further as he adds, "And." The scene shifts to memory, warm and golden, as he admits they missed him a lot. He continues, voice softening, that they truly loved him very much. Coughing weakly, alone in the dark hallway, Jonas says it is a shame that this is the very last time, and that he only wanted to see his brother's face once more. An old wizard sat trembling as memories surfaced. A gate had opened during the war, releasing something no one had prepared for. He recalled monsters from another world, and the radical faction of a new religion that followed, spreading atrocities. A voice called out to him, asking if Jonas was all right, promising him comfort for the rest of his life. His eyes flickered with regret. He whispered that he needed just a little more time, that he should have come sooner. A boot pressed forward across a dark blood-stained floor. The old man staggered through a doorway, collapsing as he reached the light beyond it. A young man lay motionless on the ground, a blade driven into his back, blood pooling beneath him as the old man knelt over him. A voice cut through the silence, acknowledging that he had somehow managed to hold on and speak after all that time. Two figures embraced in the doorway, one urging the other that they couldn't stay there forever, that it was time to go. The old man carried the wounded figure down a long staircase, his footsteps echoing with each heavy step. His face was streaked with tears as he asked why, over and over, unable to accept what had happened. He held the body close, remarking on how light it had become, asking how much starvation it had endured. The two stood before a blinding light spilling through an open doorway at the top of the stairs. The old man's face twisted, caught between a laugh and a sob as he moved forward. A shattered hall stretched before him, ruins and wreckage scattered across broken marble. He carried the body past the corpse of a great beast, its white fur soaked in blood, toward the doors ahead. He reached a hand toward the falling snow, telling Jonas softly that it had begun to snow. He explained that the ground was frozen and he could not bury him yet. They would wait until spring, and he would lay Jonas to rest in the family cemetery. He looked toward a bare winter tree, adding that once that was done, he too would finally rest. Seasons turned. The same tree, once barren, now held a small green sprout and a pale butterfly resting on its branch. The butterfly drifted onto a wooden marker beside two graves. Beneath the sunlight filtering through the trees, the old man stood before a freshly dug grave, his long weight finally over a pale hand, closed around a glowing blue crystal, the light catching against dark fabric as green fields stretched beyond. The old wizard raised his hand, fire gathering and roaring to life at his fingertips. He turned to the crystal, asking if Jonas had seen the flame he had summoned. Flames swelled higher around his palm, as he admitted it had taken this long, but he had finally done it. He explained that after years of research, he had overcome the special constitution that had once held him back, then asked quietly if it was finally all right for him to rest. He knelt over a grave beneath the trees, saying that he too could finally let go. Rain fell around him as he bowed his head to the ground, asking if he might be forgiven, even just a little. He thought back on his failures, wondering if hurrying just a little more, or not surrendering so much time to despair, could have changed everything. The ruined city stretched below him, shattered and silent as the same question echoed through his mind. His body lay still in the grass, sunlight scattering across the ground around him. A gentle voice called out, asking if the young master had suffered a bad dream. He recognized it at once, and thought of Hans, only to remember that Hans had died long ago. Light poured through a window as sharp eyes snapped open, blinking against the brightness. A young man sat upright in bed, breathless, his white hair damp with sweat. Hans turned to him, noting that he was drenched in cold sweat and looked pale. Hans crossed the room, asking if he had slept poorly the night before. The young man studied his own reflection, wondering if this was a dream, or if his life was flashing before his eyes in his final moments. He rushed toward the window, and Hans called out in alarm, addressing him as young master. He pressed against the glass, and a voice from below warned him that it was dangerous, urging young Master Jonas to come down. His eyes were sharp with frustration, as he snapped that he was fine. A boy climbed through the greenery below, laughing and waving a wooden soldier as a woman below called out to him, calling him brother. A voice called out to him from beyond the glass, speaking his name. Below, the young brother celebrated, holding up the wooden soldier, reminding him he had already been told to come down. He pressed his palm against the window, smiling despite the sweat on his brow. He whispered to himself that this was not a dream, facing the light pouring through the window. He confirmed it. He had returned to the past. A voice echoed around him, addressing the one beginning this journey, the one who had lived so profoundly alone, asking if he could stand before infinity in a world where only mana and he existed. It urged him to release his old thoughts, discard the views shaped by his past life, and break free from everything that once bound him. Bathed in blue light, his eyes turned resolute as the voice told him to become his true self. Shattered porcelain lies scattered near a windowsill as maids sweep through a wrecked room, murmuring that the young master's condition has caused another outburst. One admits she lives in constant fear of the next explosion. Two maids trade whispers about how his temper worsens by the day, blaming his illness as they speak. A shadowed figure steps through the tall double doors behind them. Hans, a servant with a bandaged head, overhears the gossip and turns sharply, ready to confront the maids on his master's behalf. Before he can move, a pale hand catches the back of his shirt, holding him in place. It is the young Master Silver, haired and composed, who tells Hans to let it go. The maid's words aren't wrong. Hans, still facing away, tells him to stop visiting altogether, reminding him that standing too close had already gotten him hurt once. A flicker of something dangerous crosses the young master's eyes before Hans drops to his knees, refusing the request outright. Kneeling before him, Hans insists he still cares, adding that this is simply a hard period the young master is passing through. A single tear slips down the young master's face as he murmurs that once it passes, none of this will matter. Hans, smiling faintly through the strain, remarks that this is simply how life goes. A memory intrudes. Bloodstains bloom across a hallway floor, the aftermath of one of the young master's uncontrolled mana explosions. He recalls, hollow-eyed, that everyone who ever cared for him ended up dead because of that same affection, killed by forces he unleashed himself. A childhood flashback surfaces. A boy laughing in a tree, calling out for his brother to play, oblivious to the danger he would one day become. The present day young master wonders what he must do, if this is truly his reality. Back in the present, he raises a hand toward the glass separating him from Hans, saying only his name. Hans answers steadily, addressing him as young master, awaiting whatever comes next. The young master orders him to leave, his voice flat as Hans turns and walks toward the light spilling through the window. The order sharpens into a shout, mana crackling violently around him as he screams for Hans to vanish from his sight immediately. In the dark that follows, Hans's quiet reply comes back. Understood alone. The young master trembles, telling himself this is the right choice, that closeness to him only puts people in danger. Walking away, Hans glances back one last time, asking him gently not to carry everything by himself. Standing alone by the tall windows, the young master recalls Hans's parting words, telling himself it is all right to trust someone sometimes. He wonders if he only imagined Hans saying that, questioning whether it was a dream born from wanting to hear it too badly. A surge of light and wind rises around him as his body reacts, mana stirring at the edges of his skin. A tear slips free as pain flashes across his face, and he questions whether any of this is truly real. In a memory of rain-soaked woods, he recalls collapsing to the ground once before, asking himself how he had died in that earlier life. Through a window, he watches a boy climbing a tree while a woman below calls out in worry, a scene from a childhood untouched by tragedy. He reasons that whether this life is dream or reality no longer matters. What matters now is preventing another mana explosion from ever happening again. His thoughts drift to the past, to a man who once suffered the same rare condition, reaching a level of power no ordinary human ever had. That man's name was Zeke von Goethe, a 10th class mage, and his own great-grandfather, whose story survived only in family records passed down through generations. After years buried in study, Zeke discovered a method to control the condition, sketching a pattern meant to hold back its danger. He carved that pattern into a mana stone, creating what would become known as a runestone. The design captured in the crystal was the product of his research, a runestone meant to contain what the body alone could not. Holding the finished stone, the young master reflects on how steady his hands feel now compared to the trembling of old age, admitting quietly that youth suits him. The special constitution's core danger was always the mana explosion, the body itself acting as a vessel meant to contain the endless flow of mana within. But his mana moved too fast, too violently, more than any vessel could reasonably hold. A normal person would die the instant that vessel shattered under the pressure. Yet, strangely, his own vessel always mended itself afterward, restoring as though the damage had never occurred. That resilience was exactly why the explosions could repeat 10 or 20 times over, each one its own quiet catastrophe. The runestone's true function, then, was to deliberately damage the mana pathways before they could fail on their own. Sustained pressure applied to that damaged point forces a new pathway to open, scattering the shock of violent mana before it can ever build toward disaster. He acknowledges the method's success rate is low, recalling he barely managed it once, just before he died in his previous life. A small flame flickers to life in his open palm, proof that the technique had worked at all. He wonders quietly whether it will work again this time, hesitating before trying once more. A young boy grips his hands together as flame erupts violently between them, the burst tearing through the air around him. His eyes widen in shock at the reaction building inside his own body. He marvels at the sheer power surging through him as light bursts from his chest. Threads of blue mana crack and spread across his body, the boy crying out as the light consumes him. Trembling, he watches the runestone pulse in his hand as flames roar around him. Fire bursts and curls from his fingers, feeding a growing fireball above his palm. He realizes with certainty that his pathways have expanded to 3. He notes that each pathway carries its own size and property, and that he can now cast 3 spells at once, startled that the method actually worked. he catches himself, realizing that mastering more spells was never his true goal to begin with. His real goal is to stop mana explosions from happening at all, standing quietly among his scattered notes and research tools. He concludes that 3 pathways alone won't be enough to achieve that. He resolves to use magic more often, deliberately increasing his pathways while minimizing the strain on his mana vessel. Holding the runestone tightly, he decides that until this work is finished, he can't allow anyone to remain close to him. Under a moonlit castle, he repeats to himself that no one should stay by his side. Hans arrives cheerfully, announcing dinner and setting down a tray for the young master. Hans mentions he brought the wheat bread the young master likes, ignoring the earlier order to leave. Hans holds out a piece of bread, coaxing him to eat since he has barely touched food lately, though the young master stays silent and unmoved. Hans grins, teasing about how sweet his own gaze and voice have gotten as he holds bread out, promising to leave the moment the young master takes a bite. In a memory, a young boy sits beside a burning fireplace, asking Hans how old he is now. Hans answers that he is 12 this year. Back in the present, the silver-haired young master reasons that acting a bit childish must be normal at his age, taking a hesitant bite of the bread. He pauses mid-bite, recognizing the taste. It has been a long time since he last had bread made by Nanny. Hans watches contentedly as the young master chews, quietly pleased to see him eating again. The young master notices Nanny's absence and asks about her. Hans explains awkwardly that her son Hinder has come down with pneumonia. Stirring his soup, the young master asks flatly whether that means she has gone back home to care for him. He remarks coldly that a nanny abandoning her post over her own child would be unthinkable in any other household, calling it a mark of a well-run family. In the past, flames devour a room as the boy quietly watches it burn. He shifts, restless, drumming his fingers against the table as steam rises from his soup. Clearing his throat, he asks pointedly whether Hinder is the only child in the area who has caught pneumonia. Hans replies that no, every child in that village has fallen ill with it, and the young master responds only with a quiet acknowledgement. A memory surfaces clearly, now something from around this same point in time that he suddenly recalls in full. The memory reveals itself as the Black Goose Village mass pneumonia incident. A maid seen collapsed in grief beside an empty bed. In that incident, the nanny lost her son, carrying the weight of that loss for the rest of her life. Wounded and lying in wreckage, the young master hears her say she is glad, calling him young master even in that state. He recalls choosing to leave first this time, unwilling to let her go through that same tragedy again. Resting his chin on his hand, he considers that the true cause of the pneumonia outbreak, revealed only later, was almost certainly something else entirely. Steam curls from the soup as Hans stands nearby, and the young master calls out to him directly. He asks sharply what kind of monsters were recently subdued near that village, his expression tense, with sudden urgency. A doe stands under a crescent moon at the edge of a snowy forest, alone in the quiet night. Without warning, the deer's calm shatters as a burst of fire erupts around it, its eyes going wide with alarm. A massive fireball tears through the trees, forcing the deer to bolt with a young man now clinging to its back. The man drops down near a burning patch of brush, catching his breath and admitting out loud that he mistook the deer for a wolf. Following a worn trail marker deeper into the woods, he arrives at a signpost reading Black Goose Village. Later, indoors at a manor, he recalls a report brought to him about a monster hunted near that same village. The man who brought the news admits he never saw the creature himself, but mentions that agents from the Magic Tower once came looking to purchase it as research material. Outside near a loaded cart, he remembers catching a brief glimpse of the thing himself, years back. The memory sharpens, a hulking, fanged shape covered in silver fur, built like some monstrous spider. A page from an old bestiary confirms the identification, a winter spider. Back in his room, the young man reads further, noting that winter spiders themselves aren't especially dangerous, but they multiply fast due to their high breeding rate. His expression sharpens as he realizes the true danger isn't the spider's strength, but the mana they carry. He recalls how prolonged exposure to such dense mana causes mana poisoning, a slow, suffocating illness, and pictures a girl gasping for breath as an unseen figure watches over her. Back in the forest at dawn, he kneels beside a patch of wild herbs, gathering them by lantern light. Turning them over in his hands, he pieces it together. The sick children of Black Goose Village must have absorbed the spider's poisoned mana. Exhausted from the climb, he pauses to catch his breath, noting that in this era, knowledge of mana poisoning is so limited people mistake it for ordinary pneumonia. Studying the herbs he has collected, he decides there is enough to ease the children's symptoms once fed to them, but he knows the relief will only be temporary to stop the sickness from returning. Every winter spider nesting nearby will need to be wiped out completely. He considers asking his parents for support, but remembers his father is posted far away at the border fortress, and his mother is off traveling the continent, chasing any lead that might cure his own unusual condition, leaving him to face the spider's nest on his own. The young man weighs his options, knowing that if he simply waits for outside help, Hinder's life will be in danger once again. The manor stands quiet under the night sky, its windows lit while the sleeping village spreads out beyond it. In a small servant's room, a maid sits blindfolded on a stool beside a covered bed, keeping watch as tears fall. A knock startles her, and she turns to find a cloaked, masked figure standing at the door. Recognizing him despite the disguise, she gasps and calls out to her young master. She asks what brings him here so late, and why his clothes are in such a state. Worried something happened back at the estate. He brushes off her concern, insisting he is fine, though she notes he is covered head to toe in dirt. She admits she came looking for him because he hadn't shown up to work in days, but before she can say more, she tries to stop him from going further inside. She warns him that Hinder has pneumonia and begs him not to risk catching it himself. He pulls his mask up higher and jokes that this should be safer now, though she is clearly unconvinced. Waving off her worry, she hands him a bundle instead, telling him to just take it. When she asks what is inside, he answers simply, herbs. He explains that they need to be crushed, boiled twice, cooled, and then given to the boy to drink. Slipping quietly into the dim room, he approaches the small bed where a boy lies sick beneath the covers. Kneeling beside him, he spots bluish marks scattered across the boy's face and confirms silently to himself that it is indeed mana poisoning. He gently calls the boy's name, asking if he can hear him, while the worried mother watches from the doorway. Barely conscious, the boy mumbles his name Isaac and begs him not to fire his mother, afraid she'll lose her job over his illness. The mother breaks down, explaining through tears that she hasn't been able to work because she has had to care for her sick son. He reassures her firmly that he has no intention of firing her. Turning back to the boy, he rests a hand on his forehead and tells him that his mother is the only one who ever sneaks him wheat bread, so all he needs to do now is focus on getting better. Later, under a calm daytime sky, he and a companion arrive at the entrance to an overgrown cave, the abandoned mine he had been searching for all along. At the mouth of a dark cavern, his companion asks if he is certain this is a limestone cave, and he confirms it firmly. The man in brown thanks him and takes a coin from his hand, saying he'll handle things from here. The man warns him to be careful, mentioning that people have gone missing in the area before, and he thanks him for the warning as he holds up his lantern. Walking deeper alone, he reasons that winter spiders favor limestone caves, and since this is the only one nearby, it is almost certainly their nest before stepping inside. A bright glow flares in his palm standing, under the open sky. He tells himself it is time to prepare, sparks of light gathering around his hands. He recalls how, by carving new pathways into his mana circuit, he gained the ability to cast 3 spells at once, giving him output equal to second-class magic. But he reminds himself, there's a limit. Pushing too hard could shatter his mana vessel entirely. Since he has no idea how many spiders wait inside, he decides he can't afford to use magic carelessly. He looks down toward a small cluster of berries growing near his feet, knowing exactly why he needs them. The plant is revealed to be frost belladonna, its dark berries glinting faintly in the dim light. Kneeling to study it against a page from his book, he confirms it matches the description, normally diluted into a paralytic or anesthetic but lethal poison to winter spiders. Specifically, plucking a sprig from the plant, he remarks on the irony that the spiders share their habitat with the one thing that can kill them. Under a bright, clear sky, he lets out a tired breath, the gathered berries safely tucked into his bag. Only then does he notice the rash spreading across his fingers, muttering that he really should have brought gloves. With a pouch of runestones tied at his waist, he decides that is enough preparation and it is time to move. He steps toward the cave entrance, the light from within casting long shadows over the vines and rock. Descending carefully along the jagged ledge, he tells himself that dying somewhere like this would be a truly meaningless death. Deeper in, he spots something below and wonders how he is supposed to climb down to reach it. Looking over the edge, he finds an old rope and plank bridge stretched across the gap, worn but still gripping the rope tight. He lowers himself down before climbing further into the depths, using a wooden ladder toward the glowing light below. His foot lands on solid ground, and he doubles over at the bottom, catching his breath after the long descent. Straightening up, he scans the wide chamber ahead and murmurs that it looks like he has found the right place. Piles of bones lie scattered across the cavern floor, all of them drained completely of fluid. Sifting through the remains, he notices one bone stands apart from the rest, a human collarbone. His expression tightens. As he wonders whether these remains belong to the missing people the hunter mentioned earlier, movement flickers at the edge of his vision, and he snaps his head up, startled. Skittering shapes rush toward him from the shadows, closing in fast. He steadies himself, sweat on his brow, as flame gathers and crackles to life in his open palm. Rising to his feet amid the bones, fire blazes around him as he readies his spell. One of the creatures lunges forward, launching a fireball of its own straight at him. He notes that these things fear fire, so his flames should hold them back for a while, sending a burning wave sweeping through the cavern to force them into retreat. Catching his breath, he reminds himself he needs to prepare properly before the spiders regroup and swarm him all at once. Reaching into his bag, he pulls out the container holding the frost belladonna berries he gathered earlier. Kneeling on the cavern floor, he sets the plant beside him and readies himself for what comes next. He tosses the berries directly into the flames, and the plant ignites in a burst of fire. A pale green smoke rises from the burning berries, drifting outward and curling toward the shapes, lurking in the dark. Two winter spiders twitch and convulse as the poisoned smoke reaches them, their red eyes flickering weakly as he steadies himself and declares quietly that the hunt begins now. In a vast study lined with towering bookshelves, a pale-haired young man sits alone at a grand desk beneath tall windows, surrounded by stacks of documents, quietly working through the morning light. A furious voice cuts through the room, demanding to know how the territory's affairs have been allowed to fall into such ruin. The young lord's hand pauses over his letter, pen still pressed to the page. Outside, a group gathers on the estate grounds. One man presses close to the window, pointing accusingly toward the manor, while another warns him to mind his tone, reminding him he stands before someone of high authority. The angry man shouts back, refusing to back down, declaring he has every right to question the ruler of this land, especially over his failure to protect the people under his care. The young lord watches from behind the glass, expression unreadable, as the man outside demands answers for why an entire settlement, Black Goose Village, was left to fend for itself and abandoned. He turns away from the noise, murmuring only that it has grown too loud for his liking, dismissing the commotion outside with quiet irritation. Back at his desk, he considers having the window sealed shut to block out further disturbances, resting against his chair as candlelight flickers over his unfinished letter. Reconsidering, he wonders instead whether he should simply relocate his work to the basement below, away from prying eyes and shouting voices. He reasons that the basement's silence and isolation would let him focus without interruption, particularly on the private research into his own unusual constitution. Flipping through an old tome covered in strange script, he plans to line the basement walls with dimetridium, a mineral known for resisting magic, to guard against any accidental mana explosions during his experiments. Turning toward someone off panel, he asks for an opinion on his plan, addressing his attendant Hans directly, a faint, knowing smile on his face. The scene shifts to the same room from behind, the young lord seated at his desk, calling out Hans's name into the quiet chamber as light falls across the polished floor. His expression turns distant, eyes narrowing in thought as he stares off to the side, the weight of memory settling behind his calm features. In a close, shadowed frame, he murmurs Hans's name again under his breath, the sound trailing into something quieter, almost like recognition returning to him slowly. Time seems to fold as he continues writing, the study around him rendered in cooler, more muted tones, pen scratching steadily across paper. His focus deepens, jaw set, eyes fixed downward, the same repetitive motion of ink meeting parchment continuing without pause. The writing accelerates, panel after panel blurring together, his gaze finally lifting, one eye catching the light, sharp and searching. Pulled back further, the desk and its stacks of books appear small and distant, the lone figure still bent over his work in the emptiness of the room. Deep underground, faint magical mist curls through a cavern lit by scattered embers, where a hooded figure kneels beside a small fire, a shovel and worn pack resting nearby. Wrapped in a scarf against the cold, the same figure looks up, weary eyes narrowing, silently questioning why these old, faded memories keep resurfacing now. Deep in a frozen cavern, the winter spiders begin twitching and stumbling, their movements growing sluggish. He notes with satisfaction that the frost belladonna he prepared is finally taking effect on them. He explains to himself that feeding the poison directly to the spiders was never an option. Burning the herb instead lets its smoke spread through the cave, slowly paralyzing the creatures until they suffocate. Aware that the toxic smoke would affect him just as easily, he had wrapped a wet handkerchief around his face beforehand, using it as a basic filter against the fumes. He channels the mana inside his body to purify the tainted air around himself, a faint blue glow spreading across his coat as he works through the toxic haze. While maintaining the purification, he forms a fireball, compresses it tightly, and activates phase shift to stay alert and ready for whatever the weakened spiders might attempt. 3 techniques run in parallel: purification magic clearing his air, fire magic building destructive force, and phase shift layered over it all to keep him a step ahead of danger. He reveals that he can now cast 3 spells at once through separate mana circuits, a method he calls a multi-circuit. It buys him the time he needs while the poisoned spiders grow weaker. With a sharp motion, he extends a single finger toward the creatures and speaks calmly, delivering their end with one quiet word. The compressed fireball detonates in a violent burst of light and heat, tearing through the weakened spiders in an instant. Flames continue rippling across the cavern floor as he walks steadily through the firelit wreckage, backpack slung over his shoulder, unbothered by the destruction around him. Catching movement at the edge of his vision, he notices the surviving spiders aren't scattering at random. They're all fleeing toward the same direction. Curious rather than alarmed, he muses aloud that there must be a water source somewhere ahead, guessing at what could be drawing them all that way. His boots move steadily through the burning terrain as a massive shape stirs in the flames ahead. Something far larger waiting within the fire. He notes it is convenient that the spiders burn easily, though he worries that the growing smoke might soon suffocate him as well. Adding dryly that the heat isn't helping either. Determined not to let the fight drag on, he tells himself he needs to end this quickly. His coat rustling as sparks drift around him. He continues onward into a deeper, ice-lined chamber, torchlight flickering off jagged icicles as he approaches a still, frozen pool of water. Shivering, he admits it is colder here than expected, regretting having discarded his coat earlier in the fight. Stepping onto the frozen ground, he reflects in surprise that the temperature dropped enough to form solid ice beneath his feet. Something catches his eye embedded in the ice, and he stops, narrowing his eyes as a suspicion begins to form. Looking up, he finds the ceiling packed with countless translucent orbs and realizes, with quiet disbelief, that the entire cavern is filled with spider eggs. Staring at the endless clusters of eggs above, he grows uneasy, hoping the sheer number doesn't mean what he suspects. It might. A sharp burst of blue energy tears through the cavern from above, and he freezes, sweat forming as he senses something massive closing in. Footsteps echo as he moves cautiously across the ice, the heavy pulsing sound following him step by step until he turns back, tension rising on his face. Standing alone on the frozen floor, he raises a hand and ignites a small flame, preparing himself for whatever is stirring in the dark. He hurls the fireball forward, and a violent gust of wind rises to meet it, the two forces colliding in the shadows ahead. A trail of fire flickers out overhead as he watches carefully, his expression tightening with the realization that something far larger than the other spiders has appeared. A massive armored spider descends from above, its red eyes glowing through the dark, an icy blade, like limbs slicing down as he stands frozen in place. The creature's spear-like leg crashes down where he stood, forcing him to twist and dive out of the way as the ice around him shatters violently. He is flung across the frozen ground by the impact, sliding hard until he crashes to a stop, letting out a pained groan. Cursing under his breath, he complains that his instincts for trouble are always disturbingly accurate, wiping sweat from his brow as he looks up at the towering threat. Recognizing the creature immediately, he identifies it as a winter spider queen, its crystalline form radiating danger far beyond the smaller spiders he faced earlier. Unlike its subordinates, this spider carries fire resistance and breathes frost itself, the very trait that gave the entire species its name. More icy blades rain down around him as he raises his weapon in defense, barely managing to shield himself from the relentless assault. He lashes out with a burning strike, launching a blazing arc through the air that slams directly into the Spider Queen's armored body. He notes grimly that ordinary fireballs won't be enough to burn this one down the way they did the weaker spiders. Understanding he is facing a tougher fight, smoke rises faintly from the Queen's frame as she recovers, and he observes that her only weakness seems to be her lack of agility. Exhausted, he grits his teeth, sweat dripping down his face as fatigue starts to catch up with him mid-battle. He acknowledges silently that his body is nearing its limit, reminding himself that a 12-year-old frame with no real combat experience was never built to handle a full night, without sleep followed by non-stop spellcasting. The Spider Queen looms above him, again, her massive form pulsing with dark energy as he stands his ground, refusing to back down, despite his exhaustion. His eyes lower in quiet reflection, a flicker of memory surfacing, as he begins to recall something from long before this moment. His mind drifts to a simple memory, recalling how genuinely delicious the wheat bread Hans once gave him had tasted. in a northern land where wheat could never grow. He remembers that the only reason he ever got to taste soft bread instead of the usual coarse rye was because of his nanny. He recalls how she used to travel to a distant city every single week just to bring back high-quality wheat, all because he had been such a picky child who despised rye bread. Smiling faintly beneath his mask at the memory, he tells himself that once this is over, he'll ask her to bake him as much of that bread as she can. Snapped back to the present, he stands firm with his shovel in hand, watching the flaming projectile streak toward the towering Spider Queen. He reminds himself grimly that no matter how powerful she looks, a queen is still just an arachnid underneath all that ice and armor. His makeshift weapon slams into a frozen carapace, the impact sending shards scattering as he is thrown backward by the force of the collision. Ice explodes outward from the strike as the Spider Queen recoils, giving him just enough space to land and reset his stance for another attempt. Gripping his shovel tightly, he locks eyes with the creature, refusing to back down as she surges forward again with terrifying speed. Her limb crashes down where he barely dodges, green blood splattering as his weapon connects, the shriek of impact tearing through the cavern. He is sent tumbling through the air from the recoil, twisting hard as her massive form looms above, still recovering from the last exchange. Steel meets ice again in a flurry of clashing strikes, each blow ringing out sharply as neither side manages to land a decisive hit. Bracing himself against the force barreling toward him, he grits his teeth and forces himself to withstand the pressure of her next assault. He realizes bitterly that his aim isn't precise enough to strike true, and he no longer has the time to charge another fireball properly, knowing that even a lucky hit wouldn't be fatal against her fire resistance. Deciding there is no other option, he abandons the idea of a ranged attack entirely and channels raw fire directly into his hand instead. Unlike his earlier spells, this flame feels different, and he focuses fully on generating and compressing it into something far more concentrated. Pushing the compression further, the fire condenses into a blinding, unstable orb crackling with barely contained energy. With a furious shout demanding she finally fall, he drives the attack forward, the explosive burst slamming directly into the Spider Queen's body. Struck at last by the true force of the blow, her massive form shudders violently under the impact. A monstrous shriek tears through the cavern as she writhes, flames and ice colliding violently across her wounded form. Sound and light tore through the darkness as a massive spell collided with something hidden in the storm, purple magic slicing across a raging blue current. The blue force gathered shape, revealing a beast wrapped in ice and flame, its jagged form thrashing against the surge that bound it. A young man hung suspended in the current, his arm caught fast inside the swirling energy. He gritted his teeth, telling himself he had to pull free before his shaking body gave out. His hand finally slipped loose. Relief crossed his face for only a second before his body went limp and began to fall. The beast collapsed above him, shattered by the force of the clash, while he dropped through the icy chasm below, blood marking the stone he grazed on the way down. He landed hard against the rocks, unconscious, as the last embers of the battle crackled and faded around him. Single frozen core remained, drifting quietly in the dying light, the only trace left of the monster he had destroyed. Consciousness returned slowly. He opened his eyes to unfamiliar wooden beams above him and asked himself where he was. Outside the room, hushed voices carried through the walls. A woman was asking whether anyone had been told the young master had left the estate, worried that the truth would cause an uproar. He recognized her voice as his nanny, and just beyond her stood a familiar man he called Hans. Hans pressed her further, asking if she truly didn't know that the young master had gone all the way to the abandoned mine. She admitted a hunter had guided him there, but said the hunter had gone off on his own hunt since, leaving no way to track his path. In his memory, the boy replayed what had happened. He had defeated the Winter Spider Queen, struck his head, and lost consciousness, only fortunate to wake before things turned worse. He'd barely dragged himself out of the mine and back toward the village. On his way back, he had crossed paths with Hans, loitering near the village entrance. Hans had caught him just as exhaustion took over, holding him steady as the boy drifted into sleep in his arms. Now awake in bed, he lay quiet, a bandage on his cheek, while behind the door his nanny explained that the herbs he had given had completely cured Hinder. She spoke warmly of the boy's kindness, saying that even after the mana explosion left him more sensitive, his good heart hadn't changed one bit. Hans and the nanny stepped into the room, delighted to see him awake, greeting him with relief. The nanny turned serious, pressing him about the danger he had walked into, unwilling to accept his silence as an answer. He deflected, claiming he had merely slipped while gathering herbs nearby, reasoning silently that no one would believe a 12-year Old had actually killed a monster. Setting the subject aside, he asked instead about Hinder's condition, and his nanny answered with a tired smile that the herbs had helped him recover well, along with the other children in the village. Relief settled over him at the news. He decided it was safer to keep the mana poisoning buried as well. Just another secret to carry alone. If word ever reached the higher-ups, scholars would come poking around, and the frozen corpses of the winter spiders scattered through the abandoned mine would only invite trouble. Two men wandering the tunnels with lanterns stumbled onto the wreckage, stunned that every spider had already been slain by someone unknown. His nanny pressed again, asking how he had known which herbs to use, since even the doctor sent by the master hadn't known. He brushed it off simply, saying he'd read about them in a book somewhere. Wanting to end the conversation, he told Hans it was time to go. Hans hesitated, pointing out that snow was already falling outside. He reminded Hans plainly that if anyone learned he'd left the estate, it wouldn't go well for either of them. His nanny returned with a basket of tomatoes, insisting he take some along before he left. She explained the villagers wanted him to have them, as thanks for everything he'd done. He held one of the tomatoes in silence for a moment, then told his nanny to take another week off from her duties. She asked if that would really be alright, worried the head butler wouldn't simply let it slide. He shot back, asking who had given her permission to rest in the first place, teasing her lightly, holding up a tomato instead. He told her to turn them into jam. She blinked in surprise, repeating the word jam while he chewed on one and explained he wanted it paired with wheat bread on the day he returned to work. She studied him fondly, clearly touched by the thought behind his request. He smiled and offered another idea, suggesting apple pie instead. She agreed easily, saying it sounded good, as snow drifted quietly over the small house behind them. Time shifted forward, sunlight now pouring over a grand estate as a distant figure ran across its courtyard grounds. He pushed himself harder, breath ragged, sprinting through the gardens as a full week passed since that night in the mine. He kept running, chest heaving, explaining that during this stretch of time, his mana vessel itself had changed. His 3 mana circuits had grown by 1, bringing the total to 4. The vessel had stabilized further, letting him cast up to 4 spells at once. And he suspected that fighting the winter spiders and pushing his limits that day had been what triggered the growth. He reasoned that daily running had likely played its part too, driving himself forward with steady effort. Using magic demanded comprehension, calculation, and instinct all at once, a burden that drained the mind the way physical strain drained the body. When the body broke down, the mind followed close behind, since mental strength itself depended on physical stamina. He realized the true reason he'd hit his limit so fast back in the abandoned mine was simple. This body was young and had never been trained. A memory surfaced from his past life of Lucas sparring with him using wooden swords, building his endurance session after session. Lucas had grinned, satisfied with the training, while his own younger self focused on fastening his collar afterward. A voice called out to him, addressing him as young master, pulling him back into the present. 2 men approached the estate grounds, one carrying a case, announcing that his regular checkup had arrived. He recognized them at once as head butler Schiller and the physician accompanying him. The doctor greeted him warmly, asking how he'd been feeling that day. The narration explained this was the personal doctor assigned by his father, said to be the finest physician in the neighboring territory, though even he couldn't fully grasp the boy's unusual constitution. The doctor examined him at the garden fountain, remarking that nothing serious stood out this time. He added that the boy actually looked healthier than he ever had before. He proposed gradually adjusting the medicine, prompting the boy to think privately that the man was drawing his own conclusions without knowing the full truth. The doctor unfastened his case and revealed a set of vials filled with shimmering purple liquid, calling it a potion known as panacea, said to stabilize the flow of mana. The boy studied the vial in his hand, thinking to himself that his father really had spared no expense in securing the good stuff. Panacea meant cure, all in the common tongue, prized by some as a stimulant and used by soldiers to enhance their performance. Its supposed effect of stabilizing mana had actually stemmed from a mistranslation, an error that crept in centuries ago while ancient texts were being interpreted. In truth, the potion stimulated the flow of mana rather than calmed it, meaning for someone like him whose mana already ran wild, it acted as pure poison. He decided that under his current circumstances, it could still serve as a useful catalyst, one that might help push his mana circuits further if handled carefully. The doctor took his leave, telling Schiller he'd return the following month. As the doctor's footsteps faded across the courtyard, Schiller lingered behind, studying the boy with a measuring look before asking if he had something on his mind, noting how unusually calm he seemed today. Schiller questioned why he wasn't reacting the way he usually did, since normally he threw fits over being seen by others. He reminded Schiller dryly that every doctor in the direct territory had already refused to serve as his personal physician because of those very fits, then asked flatly if he was supposed to throw one now. Schiller's expression shifted as he brought up something else entirely, mentioning that he'd heard about the pneumonia cure in Black Goose Village. Caught off guard, he asked how Schiller could possibly have known about that. Schiller replied simply that he'd learned of it through Hans, standing beside him near the fountain. He muttered under his breath that Schiller must have interrogated Hans directly, while the old butler warned that if the fact ever became public, the advisory committee wouldn't stay silent about it. He decided to let the matter go this time, accepting the warning without argument. Schiller added firmly that he expected restraint from him going forward. He reflected quietly on how he'd never been able to get close to Schiller, not even after all this time. Schiller was known throughout the household as an unbending, distant figure, a cold old man who never let anyone close yet if he truly couldn't hold back his abilities. Schiller offered him an alternative to consider. Schiller extended the suitcase toward him, asking only that he discuss things with him first, before acting alone. He recalled something Jonas had told him just before he died, a memory that surfaced unbidden. Schiller had served the Goethe family faithfully since the time of the previous patriarch, remaining loyal until the household itself finally collapsed and losing his life in the end. He smiled to himself, understanding that beneath the coldness, Schiller secretly cared a great deal and thanked him for it aloud. Schiller then changed the subject, noting that he'd been running every day recently, and asked if there was a particular reason behind it. He explained that throughout history, every mage who reached the 5th class or higher had trained their body as well, reasoning that a vessel channeling mana needed a suitable level of fitness to match. Schiller's eyes narrowed thoughtfully at the explanation. Word had already spread that the eldest young master had cured the children of Black Goose Village of their pneumonia, and the verification process confirming it was now complete recorded late into the night by candlelight. Given the nature of his constitution, Schiller noted that using magic might prove difficult for the young master going forward, and considered that a path as a scholar or alchemist could suit him better, instead believing this would ease some of his father's worries. A knock came at the door, and he called out simply for whoever it was to come in. Rosa pushed the door open at night, calling out to the man inside. The head butler looked up, recognizing her at once, tired of her constant visits. Rosa clasped her hands nervously, apologizing for the intrusion, but unable to hold back her worry. She told him maids kept vanishing without returning. He replied he knew nothing of Clara, but Annette was diligent and hadn't missed a day in 3 years. Rosa wasn't convinced, murmuring to herself that something wasn't right. Alone in the dark, she pressed forward, certain something terrible had happened to her friend. A servant murmured to himself, questioning what felt so off about the recent disappearances. Sitting among the crates, Rosa and another maid discussed how 3 maids had vanished within 2 months. Bill, sweeping nearby, shrugged and said Goethe wasn't exactly a place worth staying. He pointed out the harsh northern weather and the constant threat of bandits and monsters. Rosa snapped, accusing him of planning to run away too. Bill raised his hands, claiming he was just making an observation. Rosa argued that Annette wasn't someone who would vanish without a word, since she worked hard to pay for her father's medicine. Bill scoffed, suggesting Annette might have simply grown tired of caring for her sick father. He added that she could have run off with a man she'd fallen for. Rosa turned on him sharply, warning him to watch his mouth. Bill raised his hands again, insisting he was only joking and had his own theory. The other maid muttered that she wasn't interested, but he pressed them to listen anyway. Leaning in with a grin, Bill hinted at what he really believed was behind it all. He suggested dark magic might be responsible for the missing maids. Rosa repeated the words back, uneasy. Looking toward the towering estate, she admitted it made sense, since the family living there were mages after all. The head butler stood beside the sick bed, telling the sleeping master that, if he ruled the house, wouldn't he use every kind of magic to save his son? Rosa staggered back, horrified, asking if Bill meant the missing girls had been sacrificed while still alive. Bill smiled coldly, warning that spreading rumors like that had consequences, adding that he might just be right. Rosa shouted back that the master wasn't that kind of man, reminding Bill that he'd been taken in despite being a criminal himself. Bill snapped that she'd crossed a line, bringing up his past. Startled by a voice behind him, Bill turned and gasped. The young master stood there, arms crossed, asking Bill to explain everything in detail. Bill hesitated before answering that it had all started 2 months earlier. He recalled that the maid Hilda was the first to disappear. Weeks later, Clara went missing as well, and most recently, Annette never returned from Mass that weekend. In the study, the master's father asked if he had any idea why this kept happening. He muttered in disbelief at the boy's sharp glare, unsettled by how intense it was for someone so young. He told his son he could speak honestly and promised there would be no punishment for it. The boy stayed silent, then asked if his father thought he was somehow responsible. Bill grinned nervously, suggesting the answer was obvious. The young master pressed further, telling him to think about Hans, who served him closest yet always turned up bruised or hurt. Bill fumbled through an explanation, saying that if anyone was fated to die badly, it was probably Hans. Realizing what he just admitted, he panicked over having said too much. The young master called his name flatly, sensing there was more to the story. Bill broke down, begging to be spared. He cried that he hadn't married yet, hadn't had children, and that the priest always said life was a gift from God. The master's father reached out, asking simply if he didn't want to die. The young master leaned forward, telling Bill to work for him instead of being punished. Bill's face went pale, sweat breaking out as he realized what that offer really meant. Alone in his room, he called out the names Rosa and Annette, summoning a flame that curled to life before him. The fire twisted into a burning vision of the maid, her face locked in fear and defiance as the flames roared around her. A hand shot up sharply. He confirmed those had indeed been their names, watching the blue flame flicker before him. He remembered that after Hans and his old nanny had died, everything changed. They had been the only two maids who ever volunteered to serve him, standing loyally by his side. Shattered glass and spilled potion lay scattered across the floor, blood seeping into the fabric beside the broken shards. He ordered both maids out of the room, wanting to be left alone, but one of them hesitated, worried about his injured hand. He snapped again, demanding to know if she hadn't heard him the first time. She flinched, biting back her words. He shouted that the potions were useless anyway, and told her never to bring them again. She pleaded with him not to lose hope, insisting things would surely get better. He repeated the word back bitterly, as if hope meant nothing anymore. He asked if she truly understood what it felt like to kill someone she cared about with her own hands. His fist trembled, stained and shaking, as he demanded to know if she had any idea what that was like. The maid beside her murmured his title softly, and she replied that she understood. She admitted that she too had caused a friend's death, by her own hands. He turned to her sharply, repeating the word friend in disbelief. She spoke Annette's name quietly, drifting back to a memory from long ago. She confessed that if she had only looked back at Clara once, if she had reached out her hand, she might have been able to save her. The maid told the young master she understood his situation was unique, but reminded him anyone could end up doing things they never intended. He stared ahead quietly, wondering if at least once in their life, everyone faced the same weight. Looking at his bloodied hand, he admitted that back then, Annette's own pessimism had strangely comforted him. He thought to himself that he should have asked her more about it while he still had the chance. A knock echoed through the room. Bill announced himself at the door. The young master asked if he had found out where the maids went. Bill confirmed he had, and it hadn't even taken long. Bill explained he had asked around among beggars near the roads, and their descriptions all matched. The young master pressed him for the answer. Bill revealed it was slave traders who lured people with promises of a prosperous life in the South before selling them off. He added that people wouldn't need a broker if they simply wanted to travel south on their own, remarking that the young master didn't understand how the world worked. Bill explained the traders offered transportation, mercenaries for protection against bandits, and freedom papers upon arrival, then asked how a group of young women could manage all that alone. The young master nodded, saying it made sense. Bill smirked to himself, thinking the boy was still just a clueless kid who knew nothing of the real world. Something clicked in his mind, and he wondered aloud if this could be it. He admitted it had cost him a bit of money to get the beggars talking. He confessed he'd spent all the travel funds given to him, all 20 silver coins. The young master remarked that was enough for half a year's wages. Bill laughed nervously, claiming everyone had been especially cautious. He said the money didn't matter to him, only finding the missing maids as quickly as possible. Bill's face lit up, thrilled at his generosity. He then asked if there was anything else he could do. The young master said there was. He offered to compensate him well for one more task, asking if Bill was willing to try. Bill agreed eagerly, thrilled at the thought of having landed himself an easy target. He gloated to himself, certain that a smooth tongue could take a man far, imagining the boy as nothing more than a golden goose ready to be plucked, ignoring the risk ticking beneath the surface. He offered to lead the young master straight to the broker himself, insisting there was no big money without a little risk. He laughed loudly, declaring that life rewarded those willing to gamble. Sometime later, Bill stood stripped down behind bars, letting out a hollow laugh. Surrounded by an old skull and shadows, he screamed in disbelief, demanding to know how things had ended up this way. Gripping the bars in shock, he asked himself why he was locked in a place like this. Outside the cell, the young master stood calmly, holding a glowing blue crystal in his hand. A woman leans her cheek against her hand, murmuring under her breath that something feels strange, her expression uneasy as she sits alone with her thoughts. In the courtyard of a gray estate, two maids sit on wooden crates in the dim evening light. One remarks that 3 maids have vanished in just 2 months. Bill approaches with a broom over her shoulder, questioning whether that is really so alarming, since Goethe was never a comfortable place to live in the first place. Bill continues, pointing out that the northern weather is brutal and bandits and monsters are known to strike often in the region. A blue-haired maid rounds on her, accusing her of implying she'd run away too. Bill raises her hands, insisting she was only stating facts. The blue-haired maid presses on, arguing that Annette isn't someone who would vanish without saying a word, especially since she had been working tirelessly to pay for her father's medicine. Bill smirks, suggesting instead that Annette simply grew tired of caring for her sick father and decided to abandon her responsibilities. The red-headed maid snaps at Bill, warning her to watch her mouth, while floating the idea that Annette might have run off with a man she'd fallen for. Bill turns back toward them, waving off the accusation of thoughtlessness and declaring she has her own theory about what is really happening. She tells them to just listen. Bill leans in with a sly grin, raising a finger as she begins to share her suspicion. A skull glows within a purple magic circle as Bill voices her theory aloud, that dark magic could be behind the disappearances. The red-headed maid stares up at the towering castle turret, murmuring that it makes sense since the household belongs to a family of mages. Bill adds that the young master's condition has not been improving, and questions whether if one were truly the master of the house, they wouldn't resort to any means necessary, including forbidden magic, to fix that. The blue-haired maid gasps in horror, realizing what Bill is implying, that the missing girls may have been taken and sacrificed while still alive. She demands to know what exactly Bill is talking about. Bill smirks under the night sky, twirling her broom, and warns that if the maid keeps calling her claims mere rumors, she won't just stay silent, hinting that she may in fact be right. The red-headed maid explodes in anger, declaring that the master would never do such a thing, reminding Bill that he even took in a criminal like her out of kindness. The group turns away from Bill, one maid accusing her of crossing a line, after everything she has said, walking off in clear frustration. Elsewhere, a man reacts sharply upon hearing the story secondhand, visibly shaken by what the rumor implies. A composed young man with silver hair and piercing eyes stands calmly, cloak draped over his shoulders, and asks to be told the full story in greater detail. The green-haired man's expression darkens as he begins recounting the timeline, starting from 2 months earlier. He explains that the first to disappear was a maid named Hilda. He continues, revealing that weeks later Clara went missing as well, and just this past weekend, Annette failed to return after attending Mass, completing the pattern of vanishings that has gripped the estate in fear. In a grand study lit by pale morning light, the man in black stands with hands folded behind his back, facing the study's owner, a young silver-haired noble seated at the desk. He asks whether there is any idea why so many maids have vanished, his sharp blue-eyed gaze cutting through the room with quiet suspicion. The green-haired steward flinches under that stare, muttering to himself in disbelief that a mere child could carry such an intense glare, before insisting weakly that he has no idea at all. The young lord leans back in his chair and tells him he can speak freely, promising there will be no punishment for honesty. The steward, caught off guard, asks if he is serious, and receives a calm confirmation that he is. An uneasy silence stretches between them as the steward hesitates, sweat forming on his brow. Finally, the boy asks directly whether he suspected the disappearances were his doing, causing the man to stiffen and let out an awkward cough. Forcing a grin, the steward brushes it off, insisting that it should be obvious what is really going on, laughing nervously to mask his nerves. The young lord's expression darkens as he tells the steward to think about Hans, a servant who has always served closest to him yet is constantly bruised and injured. The steward stammers, saying he can't say for certain, but if anyone were fated not to die peacefully, it would probably be Hans. Then immediately panics, realizing he has said far too much. The young master lifts his head, uttering the steward's name coldly, the weight of his tone alone enough to make clear how much trouble he is in. Terrified, the steward begs to be spared, sweat pouring down his face as his composure completely collapses. Suddenly, the scene shifts, and it becomes clear this exchange is a memory of Hans himself, who once pleaded that he hadn't even married or had children yet, protesting that the priest said their lives were gifts from God. The young master extends a hand toward him and asks plainly whether he doesn't want to die. Still within the memory, the boy offers a way out, telling Hans to work for him instead of facing death. The same offer repeats as the frightened steward from the present looks on, sweat dripping down his face, clearly recalling the same fate that once bound Hans to his young master's service. Back in the present, seated within a room glowing with blue magical light, the young lord murmurs the names Rosa and Annette softly, flames of magic curling and swirling faintly around him. Blue fire spreads violently as the maid Rosa cries out in anger and fear, her form illuminated by the surging magical blaze threatening to consume the room. A hand strikes forward through the air as the boy confirms calmly that those were indeed their names, summoning a small flickering blue flame that hovers above his fingertip. His eyes glisten with restrained emotion as he reveals that after Hans and his nanny had died, everything changed for him. He recalls that Rosa and Annette were the only maids who ever volunteered to serve him, standing together solemnly in memory, bound by loyalty despite the danger surrounding his household. A shattered vial lies broken across the carpet, its purple contents spilled and mixing with a growing pool of blood, hinting that violence has already unfolded nearby. In the dim chamber, the young master orders both maids to leave and let him be alone, but one of them hesitates, pointing out with concern that his hand is injured. Rosa freezes and stiffens as he snaps at her again, demanding to know if she didn't hear him tell them to leave. Her expression tight with worry she dares not voice aloud. A hand gripped a golden fork tightly, the knuckles tense under the sleeve of a dark coat. A voice pressed a promise made earlier, reminding its owner that he swore he would do whatever it took. A young man sat bare, chested against a stone wall, sweat on his brow, unnerved by the door creaking open in front of him. He was told plainly that before anything else could happen, there was a task he had to complete first. 3 men trudged down a torch-lit dungeon corridor, escorted deeper into the underground chamber. A hooded figure walked ahead of them, leading the group toward whatever waited beyond the arch. A rough, scarred man sat at a table in the dim cell, cutting into a plate of meat with visible irritation. One of the men behind him pointed out that he still hadn't eaten anything again that day. The scarred man forced a piece of meat into his mouth, chewing without appetite. The 3 men watching him swallowed nervously, one covering his face, while another begged him to eat something, worried about how thin he had become. His expression darkened as he gripped the fork like a weapon, demanding to know if someone was hiding inside the meat itself, staring straight ahead as if expecting an answer from the food. A skull impaled on a wooden stake sat across from him at the table, propped up like a dinner companion. He told it to wait a little longer, promising that once his black magic ritual succeeded, they would be able to meet again properly. He studied the skull's empty sockets, frustration creeping into his voice as he muttered that it still wasn't answering him. The skull's jaw sat motionless and close-up, and the man asked whether the soul bound to it had weakened, questioning if its power was fading. One of the servants asked bluntly where his bathwater had gone. The man beside him admitted awkwardly that the last of it had already been sold off as merchandise to traveling merchants. A heavy hand shot forward without warning, colliding with someone's face in a sudden, brutal strike, the impact catching the man completely off guard. The scarred man calmly carried a limp, unconscious body away by the collar, holding him aloft with one arm as red light bled across the scene behind him. Screams tore through the corridor as the body was slammed and dragged across the ground, battered and bleeding. The scarred man wiped his face and asked the remaining 2 if this one would finally be enough to cover his bathwater. He turned back toward the dungeon depths, telling whatever was waiting there that he would be back soon. One of the terrified men stammered that he would get everything ready immediately. Footsteps echoed as the scarred man walked away down the long stone hallway, his figure growing smaller beneath the flickering torches. Back in the chamber, bodies collapsed to the floor one after another, the impact scattering barrels and echoing through the empty room, leaving only stillness behind. One of the survivors knelt on the ground, catching his breath, cursing under it, and blaming the black magic ritual for the disaster that had unfolded. The 2 men stared down at a ruined plate, red streaks smeared across it where food had been. They muttered bitterly, counting how many times this had happened now, admitting the ingredients had ended up in his food, in his bathwater, everything. One man knelt to bind a companion's leg, insisting they had no choice, warning that if they didn't act, all of them would end up dead. The other simply told him to stop complaining and finish handling their captive. The scarred man crouched in the shadows nearby, listening in silence. Behind him, 2 more men pressed against the corridor wall, frozen in place, realizing too late that he might have heard everything. A strange noise echoed through the corridor. The 2 men froze, eyes darting toward each other, as the sound crept closer through the darkness. The sharp echo repeated, bouncing off the stone walls. growing louder with each pulse. One of them stammered, asking what that sound could possibly be. Both men turned their heads toward the source, tension building on their faces as a heavy crack rang out somewhere near them. One of them called out uncertainly, asking if it was their boss. Nears, approaching from the shadows. A dark shape loomed just behind them. A figure crashed to the ground, boots slamming down on the stone floor as a lifeless body rolled beside him. The two men staggered back in horror, one collapsing entirely, unable to form a coherent word beyond broken syllables. A single word cut through the silence. A massive boot came down, crushing whatever hope remained in the man cowering below. A blood-stained cleaver rose into view, gripped tightly. A calm voice asked simply if he could get some water. One of the remaining men squinted through the dim light, recognition slowly dawning in his eyes as he began to speak. Blood dripped down his own face as he realized who stood before him, stammering out a name in disbelief. Bill stood there, knife in hand, drenched in blood, walking forward without a word. Bill demanded water again, calling them bastards. Blood smeared across his grinning face as his eyes gleamed with something unhinged. Having clearly crossed a line there was no return from. A blade pressed forward in the dark, the hand gripping it trembling with reluctance, the weight of the moment pressing harder than the weapon itself. A young man's face came into focus, jaw clenched, blood at the corner of his mouth, fury simmering beneath his stillness. He placed the blame squarely on someone else, someone who had dragged him into this mess. A shirtless man knelt against a stone wall, breath uneven, eyes locked on the paper being held out before him. He asked what it was, though the dread in his voice suggested he already feared the answer. Isaac turned his head slightly, the faint light catching his pale hair and calm expression. He answered plainly, calling it nothing more than a contract, as if the word alone should settle the matter. The torches flickered along the corridor as Isaac unrolled the parchment. The first clause bound the kneeling man Bill to obey him without condition. The second sealed his silence, forbidding him from ever revealing anything about Isaac to another soul. The third clause followed, cold and final. Any violation carried a penalty of death. Bill's composure cracked. Sweat ran down his face as he stammered, demanding to know what kind of terms these truly were. Isaac's tone didn't waver. He explained that the contract required blood, not ink, to take hold, and that magic alone would bind the words to reality. He drew a blade, calling it fitting for the task. Bill recoiled, shouting that he had to be out of his mind to expect anyone to agree to this. A voice cut through the tension. Bill turned sharply toward the sound, demanding to know who was there, while Isaac stood calm beside him, the knife still in hand. Isaac didn't turn to acknowledge the interruption. He simply reminded Bill that time was running short, his expression unreadable, patience wearing thin. Bill's face twisted with desperation. He asked, almost pleading, whether Isaac didn't want to live a warning aimed at pushing him toward compliance, or perhaps toward danger neither of them could yet see. Footsteps echoed through the corridor, quick and deliberate, closing in from somewhere unseen. The contract lay exposed beneath a hand reaching down toward it, the ink catching the last light before the coming disturbance. The footsteps grew louder, echoing off stone, closing the distance. Bill's face tightened with alarm, the sound of approach impossible to ignore any longer. Isaac reacted first, curses spilling from him as he moved with sudden urgency, gripping the contract in one hand and the blade in the other, prepared to act before whoever was coming could interfere. Bill's expression hardened into resolve. Without hesitation, he pressed his own finger against the blade, drawing blood himself, choosing to act before the choice could be taken from him. Blood dripped from his fingertip onto the parchment, staining the ink below. The contract had been signed, sealed not by ceremony, but by pain and urgency. A surge of blue light erupted around them, spiraling upward as the magic took hold. Isaac watched with quiet satisfaction while the binding force swirled violently, and moments later, a new face emerged from within the light, marked by the aftermath of the ritual. Voices shouted through the corridor as three men burst forward, confused and furious, demanding to know who these strangers were and how they had escaped their confinement. Isaac moved instantly, unleashing a burst of magic toward the charging men as Bill flinched beside him, caught off guard by the sudden clash unfolding in front of him. The magic struck true, sending the attackers reeling as sound cracked through the corridor. Smoke curled around the aftermath, with Isaac standing steady, another spell already forming in his palm, while Bill remained kneeling nearby, watching the chaos settle. Bill stared at the fallen men, unsettled, asking quietly if they were dead. Isaac answered without concern, stating simply that they had only fainted, the tension finally beginning to ease. Bill's voice cracked with disbelief as he stared upward, still trying to process what had just happened to him and how any of it was possible. A crystal shard shot into Isaac's waiting hand, catching the light before settling into his palm. He examined it for a moment, recognizing it plainly for what it was. Then let a small orb of frost swirl to life above his other hand. The two of them made their way through a long underground passage, pipes running overhead and water rushing below. Their footsteps echoed steadily through the tunnel as they pressed deeper into the dark. Bill let out an awkward laugh, admitting it was the first time he had ever seen ice magic up close. Calling Isaac amazing despite the sweat still beading on his forehead, Isaac replied that the compliment made sense. Since ice magic wasn't considered very practical, Bill blinked, caught off guard, asking if that were really true. Isaac studied the glowing shard in his hand and said it only appeared that way on the surface, his tone suggesting there was more to it than most people assumed. Bill's expression sharpened as he glanced down the corridor, muttering the word bandits under his breath, alert to a presence lurking somewhere ahead. Isaac asked him plainly what was needed to create ice, his focus unshaken by the earlier tension. Bill startled at the sudden question, wondering aloud why he was asking now of all times. Isaac told him to take a guess. Bill hesitated, sweat forming again, before offering an unsure answer: water. Isaac confirmed he was right, letting a small stream of liquid coil around his fingers. He explained that whether it came from moisture in the air or puddles on the ground, the water first had to be shaped into the desired form. A swirling orb of frost expanded in his palm as he continued, explaining that the process moved through compression, condensation, expansion, and evaporation. Isaac added that managing each stage on its own was simple enough, but performing them all at once was far harder than it looked. Bill, peeking nervously around a pillar, hissed that they were about to get caught and needed to hurry. A sound cut through the quiet, drawing Bill's attention sharply to the side, his breath catching as something moved just out of sight. A stranger emerged from the shadows, demanding to know who they were. Isaac responded instantly, a surge of frost energy curling from his hand as he prepared to meet the threat head on. He raised his hand and let the spell build, ice gathering and pulsing with light before releasing forward in a single controlled motion, the target standing frozen in its path. The stranger's face contorted in shock the instant the spell connected, distortion rippling around him. Isaac calmly identified the technique as phase shift magic, watching the man vanish through a shifting portal below. Isaac continued walking, remarking that despite everything, the magic wasn't especially useful in a real fight, the frost orb dissolving quietly in his grip as Bill trailed behind him. He admitted that if he hadn't happened to have the item in question, he wouldn't have bothered using the spell at all, his expression flat and unreadable. He lifted the crystal into view, its edges sharp and gleaming, and named it a Frost Mana Stone, explaining that he had recovered it from the corpse of the Winter Spider Queen. He noted that Frost Mana Stones held real academic value and sold for a considerable price. Despite ice magic's poor reputation, a faint satisfied smile crossed his face as he admitted he had gotten his hands on something unexpectedly good. Bill questioned why anyone would bother with ice magic if it was so inconvenient in the first place. Watching two men crumple unconscious at Isaac's feet, Isaac replied that its very unpopularity was the reason, since almost no one understood how it worked. He explained that the injuries it caused were nearly impossible to distinguish from ordinary blunt trauma, and once the ice melted back into water, it left nothing behind as evidence. Isaac's expression settled into something colder and more composed as he pointed out that this made the magic ideal for staying hidden. Bill asked why he wasn't finishing the men off while they lay defenseless. Down the corridor, two more men appeared, confused about how the captive had escaped. Isaac answered that killing men like these solved nothing, since scum like them were simply replaced by more of the same. Bill pressed further, asking if they wouldn't just repeat their crimes given the chance. Isaac, already surging forward with another burst of frost, answered that this was exactly why he intended to keep them alive. The blow landed hard, sending the two newcomers crashing against the stone walls. Bill could only stare, speechless at what he had just witnessed. A single tear of ice slid down Isaac's cheek as his gaze hardened, and he murmured that his intentions went further than simply subduing them. A shape fell from above, and a new figure descended into the corridor. One of the earlier bandits shouted out in alarm at the intrusion, catching sight of it descending toward them. Bill's voice dropped as he recognized the newcomer, muttering that only one person remained standing before them. The man straightened, dark-haired and rugged, his sharp eyes narrowing on the pair as he addressed them directly, sizing up exactly who he was dealing with. Bill flinched, stammering out a name in shock, recognizing the man as one of the Nears. clearly someone whose reputation preceded him. He explained hurriedly to Isaac that this man led the bandit group, a violent figure known for tearing people apart with nothing but his bare hands. Isaac merely tilted his head, unimpressed, and asked if that were really so. Far from concerned, Isaac's expression shifted into something closer to satisfaction, remarking that this development spared him the trouble of tracking the man down himself. He raised a finger, forming a jagged spear of ice above his head, calm and deliberate as the weapon took shape. The spear tore through the air with tremendous force, streaking toward the bandit leader as the corridor lit up with frost and light. The leader's eyes widened as the projectile closed in, and at the last instant, he moved to intercept it directly with his bare hands, the impact exploding in a burst of light and shattered ice. Bill gasped, stunned that the man had actually deflected the attack barehanded. The leader grinned impressed despite himself, and asked whether Isaac hailed from one of the northern tribes to have that kind of strength. Bill snapped in disbelief, asking if this was really the moment to be admiring the enemy, panicking that they were about to be torn apart. The leader, still nursing the ache in his hand, ignored the outburst entirely. Isaac addressed the men calmly, greeting them as though there were nothing threatening about the situation at all. One of the bandits could only respond with a startled, confused sound. The leader's smile widened into something predatory as he sized Bill up, remarking that he was relieved to see the merchandise had returned, since he'd been worried he wouldn't have enough bathwater to spare, and now conveniently that problem had solved itself. Isaac's cold gaze settled on the bandit leader as he added that being a mage made the man especially useful, calling him fine material for the black magic he intended to practice. A heavy blow crashed down as the two remaining bandits screamed in terror, begging desperately to be spared, one crying out that he wasn't the one to blame. The leader's eyes burned with fury beneath the shadow of his own raised hand, blood spattering the walls as violence took hold of the corridor. He gritted his teeth against the pain, shouting that he was nothing more than an ordinary human, his composure cracking under the brutal exchange. Petals and fragments scattered through the air as the fight intensified, his face twisting with strain the closer the danger came to striking. True, a jagged spike of ice tore forward and buried itself into the leader's chest, the impact staggering him as Bill flinched at the sight from below. One of the surviving bandits stammered in disbelief, recalling that this same ice had deflected an attack only moments earlier, stunned by what he was witnessing. Isaac's expression remained fixed and severe, his hand outstretched as another surge of magic gathered at his fingertips, ready to finish what he'd started. Blood sprayed from the leader's mouth as the finishing blow connected, and Isaac spoke Bill's name quietly amid the wreckage of the fight. Turning to the man beside him, Isaac told him plainly that from this moment on, he would be the one in charge of this place. He asked, with quiet intensity, whether the man understood exactly what needed to be done now that the position had fallen to him. The man startled, sweat forming on his brow, uncertain and unsettled by the sudden shift in his circumstances. He turned and fled without hesitation, sprinting through the corridor and leaving the fallen behind him as he vanished from sight. Streaks of red bled across the scene as Isaac stood in the aftermath, a memory surfacing behind his eyes, one that reminded him how anyone could end up doing things they never wanted to do. The memory shifted to a quiet room, where a young maid once told him gently that everyone experiences a moment like this at least once in their life. She looked at the blood staining his hand and warned him softly that it likely could never be undone, that it would leave a mark on him for the rest of his days. She continued, telling him that from that point forward he would be left with only two choices to carry that burden. Either he would let the guilt of it crush him entirely, consuming him from within, or he would choose to keep living, carrying the weight forward for the sake of those he had lost as well. Isaac's thoughts drifted back to that moment, reflecting that Annette, who had once carried her own guilt over losing her friend Clara, must have been the one who gave him that advice. Long ago, back when she still held his hand as a child, a stranger stumbled forward through the corridor, exhausted and demanding water, and Bill recognized him with a shocked cry, stunned to see him alive. Isaac decided there was no reason to hear the same lesson twice, his thoughts drifting toward a carriage wheel turning through the mist as a young Annette wept in her friend's arms. He resolved that in this life, Annette would never lose her friend again, watching her walk alone through the moonlit streets toward that same waiting carriage. In the servants' quarters, a maid with warm brown hair leaned forward, eyes bright with gossip. She had a rumor to share, one that had spread quickly through the kitchens. Nobles from the south, she said, were searching for women from outside their region. Two other maids sat across the table, intrigued. One asked why southern nobles would bother looking elsewhere. The answer came fast, tinged with mockery. Word was that the women of the south weren't considered attractive, so the nobles had turned their search outward, hunting for prettier brides. Another young maid, dark-haired and quieter, leaned in with a teasing grin. She wondered aloud whether she should try her luck heading south herself. Then, almost carelessly, she admitted she'd already done some digging into the matter. Her expression shifted, sly and knowing. She revealed what she'd learned, that someone existed who could arrange transport south, and all it required was a bit of money slipped into the right hands. Later, in a dim room lit only by a window, that same offer was extended directly. 2 names were called, Hilda and Annette, asked plainly if they wanted to join whoever was heading south. One of them, sharp-eyed and steady, sat there with fabric in her hands, listening. She refused. Sweat beaded at her temple as she gave her reason. She had a father to look after, and going south simply wasn't an option for her. Years passed, and that refusal became the last memory anyone had of 2 girls, Hilda and Clara, who chose differently. They vanished. No word ever came back from them. Now, standing before a nobleman at his desk, the maid recounted this history as part of a much larger story. The nobleman, silver-haired and sharp-featured, connected the pieces aloud. It matched exactly what someone named Bill had already suspected. He asked her directly whether she'd been kidnapped while searching for the 2 missing girls. She confirmed it, her voice flat with old pain. She had found Hilda and Clara again, but not in any world she recognized. She found them in the sewers below. By then both girls had lost their minds entirely. The nobleman absorbed this, his gaze distant. He admitted that if he'd stayed down there even a few more days himself, he might have broken the same way. The truth of that place was laid bare. The sewer was somewhere people were sold, or worse, consumed. Even a man who had lived 70 years admitted the sight had shaken him to his core. He couldn't fathom what it must have done to girls so young. Back in the present, he considered something quietly, the fact that she could have run at any point during her captivity. Escape had been possible. Her memory carried her back to that moment, standing before the iron gate. It had been broken, its lock no longer holding her in place. Freedom sat right in front of her. But before she could act, a horrible sound reached her, a broken laugh. Yoo-hoo, hic. Drifting through the dark golden eyes flicked toward the noise, sharp with dread. There, past the bars, sat someone she recognized. Hair tangled, posture broken, hands trembling in her lap. It was Clara, reduced to something barely holding together, rocking quietly in the ruins of what they'd endured. She hesitated at the gate, sweat cold against her skin. A thought crossed her mind, unbidden and painful, that maybe if she had just stayed a few more days herself, things might have gone differently. Her hand rested against the cold iron bars, gripping tight. The thought of walking away, of leaving Clara there alone in that place, was almost too much to bear. But in the end, she chose to leave, understanding a hard truth as she did. If she'd stayed any longer, she might have ended up killing her own friend with her own hands. The nobleman, listening to all this, finally understood, so that was what had truly happened down there. He acknowledged how hard it must have been to relive those memories, and thanked her for trusting him with the story. She brushed it off awkwardly, unsure how to respond to his gratitude. Still, something nagged at her, a detail she couldn't shake. She admitted there was one more thing bothering her. He looked up, curious, and asked what it was. Her memory drifted back further to the night the bandits finally released them, sending them back toward the mansion. She and Clara had sat together in that moment, hands clasped, quietly happy to be going home. But Hilda had reacted differently. Her fingers trembled against her own mouth, teeth pressed into her knuckle. Panic flickered behind her eyes as she muttered that returning to the mansion wasn't something she could do, that going back would mean something terrible. The nobleman repeated the claim carefully, questioning whether returning truly meant death for the girl. The maid confirmed it, her voice certain Hilda's fear hadn't looked like the fear of punishment. It had looked like something far deeper. He sat with that thought, chin resting on his hand, murmuring that he understood enough for now and would look further into it himself. Later in the study, she brought up another detail. A fellow maid named Rosa had voiced her own theory that the reason the bandits had suddenly released them all might have had something to do with him, the young master himself. He scoffed at the idea, arms folding across his chest, sweat breaking slightly at his temple. Nonsense, he said under his breath, though he silently noted how sharp Rosa's instincts were. The maid continued, a faint blush touching her cheeks as she admitted the theory wasn't entirely unreasonable. After all, she said, the only person who had ever paid attention to maids like them was him. He held his composure, arms crossed, expression unreadable despite the praise directed his way. He addressed her directly by name, Annette, and offered his gratitude plainly, telling her he appreciated everything she'd shared. She began to bring up one more point, hesitated, then decided against it, saying they could continue the conversation another time. With a polite nod, She excused herself from the room alone now. He rose and shut the door behind her. Then he pulled a hidden blade from his desk, drawing it out with quiet purpose. A satisfied smile crossed his face as he considered what he'd learned. He'd found unexpected talent in her. A spark worth cultivating, perhaps, he thought. It was worth teaching her magic properly. The story shifted to a grand fortress standing beneath open skies, its towers catching the light. Elsewhere, servants gossiped in hushed tones about maids who had recently returned to the estate. The story continued. The two girls had originally been marked for dismissal, but young Master Isaac had personally intervened and taken them back in, a decision that reportedly sparked a fierce argument with the head butler. One maid, smirking to herself, wondered aloud why he'd go through such trouble for a pair of ordinary young maids. She speculated that maybe something more was going on, that he was simply at the age where boys start noticing girls. Meanwhile, Isaac moved through a quiet passage, slipping through a side door with quiet urgency, his hand brushing along a rope in the shadows. Following it deeper, he found a man stacking crates in a dim chamber. The man straightened, addressing him with rough familiarity, asking if he was there. "Boss." Isaac snapped back sharply, cursing and reminding the man not to call him that. The man behind him carried papers marking him clearly: Bill Neers, the new leader of the criminal group operating below the city. Standing in the tunnels with a hooded companion, Bill remarked that the sewers were always crawling with drifters and criminals. He added grimly that wiping out one gang here changed nothing. Another would always rise to take its place. Isaac stood before Bill, hand outstretched, offering a proposal instead of open conflict. Rather than fighting each other, he suggested, "Wouldn't it be smarter to let him take control and manage the gang directly?" Bill stared back, sweat forming, clearly caught off guard by the offer. Bill's mind raced, piecing together the manipulation behind it all. He realized this had been planned from the very start. The reason Isaac had forced him into signing that binding contract. He laughed bitterly, gripping his own head, understanding that if a mutiny or conflict ever broke out among the men, his neck would be the first one cut. Isaac dropped something heavy to the ground with a thud. He turned to the remaining men and asked bluntly whether Neers had only ever planted them inside the mansion. One of the men, bald and rough-looking, confirmed it. The previous boss, he explained, had ordered them to keep watch over the estate. Bill considered this new information with a smirk, calling Neers a fool for infiltrating noble households the way he had. Still, he admitted grudgingly that the man hadn't been entirely without purpose after all. Bill continued explaining, adding one more detail every year. The previous boss had always prepared a tribute of some kind. Isaac's expression sharpened with surprise. A tribute? He asked what exactly that tribute had been for. Bill answered directly, saying it was meant for the knights, offered around this particular time of year as part of an old arrangement. He explained further, revealing the deeper truth behind the gang's survival in the slums. The reason they'd been able to settle into this gutter safely, he said, was because the knights themselves had been protecting them. Isaac's eyes widened at the revelation, repeating the words back, asking if the knights truly had their backs. Several days passed. Isaac walked alone through a dim, luxurious room late at night. Deep in thought, as he crossed the polished floor, fire erupted from his palm, launching in a wide arc across the chamber as he moved with practiced precision, hurling the blazing orb through the air. As the flame soared, he narrated his own strategy silently. The fire, he explained, was only a decoy. The true attack was something else entirely, hidden just behind it. Right on cue, a crystal of solid ice trailed the fireball closely, cutting through the same path just moments behind the flame. The fireball detonated against the far wall in a burst of light and heat, shaking the room with the force of impact. An instant later, the ice crystal followed through, striking cleanly and shattering apart in a spray of frozen shards across the same spot. Isaac exhaled, catching his breath as he studied the aftermath. He reflected quietly to himself that after he had killed Neers, his mana circuits had grown, increasing from 4 up to 5. He considered what came next, resolving that he now needed to master multicasting, layering different types of magic together in a single motion. He reminded himself that his victory over Neers had come down to luck alone, nothing more. His thoughts turned analytical, breaking down exactly why Neers had died. It was his familiarity with that territory, the fact that his enemies had appeared weaker than he actually was, and his complete ignorance of certain conditions, all combined, that had let his guard down and cost him his life in the end. Isaac's gaze turned cold and sharp. He corrected the thought firmly. No, he said. He hadn't simply been given that victory, he had taken it himself, fist clenched with quiet determination. Later, he lay stretched across the floor, recalling old memories. Before dying, A man named Jonas had told him many things, including detailed knowledge about the enemies of House Gerda. He stretched his arms out, considering the weight of that inherited knowledge. Every piece of it, he realized, had been optimized specifically for dealing with mages just like himself. Isaac closed his eyes, resolving that he wouldn't get another stroke of luck like the one that had saved him against Niers. He couldn't count on chance a second time. Under the night sky, his thoughts settled into a clear purpose. He needed to grow stronger, and he needed to do it to protect House Gerda from whatever threats lay ahead. A sharp voice startled him from his thoughts. Someone called out to him urgently, addressing him as young master, and his eyes snapped open in surprise. A maid and a servant approached with a tray, informing him that morning had already come and urging him to get up quickly. Another servant relayed instructions, calling for Hans to bring the young master's clothes. A woman nearby confirmed the request immediately. Confused, Isaac asked what was happening and why they were suddenly rushing him this way. The maid kneeling by a wash basin answered plainly, questioning why he even needed to ask. She lifted a cloth toward him and delivered the real reason behind the urgency. The master, she said, had returned home. Isaac froze as she wiped his face, the news catching him completely off guard. His expression shifted from confusion to quiet shock as the weight of the announcement sank in. The scene shifted to a rider approaching a grand fortress beneath a swirling wind. Touched sky, a sword strapped firmly across his back as he crossed the bridge toward the gates. Isaac stared upward, repeating the news to himself in disbelief, asking whether his father was truly here. Tally marks covered the walls, counting days that stretched into years. An old man sat alone at a worn desk candlelight, flickering beside stacks of books, his back bent under the weight of decades spent waiting. A pen scratched across old parchment, footsteps echoed through the doorway. The old man lifted his head and whispered a single word. "Father?" A younger man stood in the doorway, a bag and sword in hand. The old man studied his face, disbelief settling in, and spoke a name he hadn't said in a long time. Isaac. Isaac stepped closer and knelt behind the old man's chair. Dust and torn paper scattered across the floor, remnants of a room lived in for far too long. Isaac lifted a pair of scissors to the old man's hair. He asked quietly if this was what he wanted, and the old man agreed without hesitation. A sword rested against the light streaming through the window. Isaac's voice was steady as he promised the old man his end would come without suffering. Isaac's eyes were calm, his hands steady as he continued cutting the old man's hair, preparing him for whatever came next. Books and a candle sat on the desk. A voice asked if this truly was his desire. The answer came simply, yes. Isaac accepted the answer and pulled the old man close, forehead against forehead. He told him this would be the last time their paths would cross. Isaac turned to leave, promising he would go ahead and wait, so that when the old man came to him again, things would be different. The old man stood alone in his room, the tally marks behind him, and heard the final words meant to release him. Leave all your regrets behind. A grand study filled with light replaced the dim room. A young man with silver hair and blue eyes sat inside, remarking that this was the first time he had seen someone since that day. Across from him, a composed man in formal attire read a letter, addressing him only as father. The father lowered the letter, informing the young man that he had heard about him treating sick children in Black Goose Village. The father asked if it was true and questioned whether Schiller had told him. The young man confirmed it, admitting he'd doubted his own ears at first. The young man brushed it off, insisting it was nothing more than luck. The father explained further, saying he'd simply come across a book describing a rare form of pneumonia that matched the symptoms the village children showed. He fell silent afterward, studying his son. The father asked how his body was feeling. Onlookers noted quietly that he was letting the matter slide, choosing not to push further. A doctor brought in from Othon offered medicine, praised for his skill. The young man accepted it outwardly, though inwardly he doubted the doctor had done anything useful at all. Sunlight poured through the study window as father and son sat across from each other, the room quiet, the distance between them still lingering, despite everything shared. The father asked calmly how things were going, his gaze steady from behind his desk. The young man went still for a moment before answering with a question of his own. At the border fortress Winterband, the father asked why he wanted to know, curious if he was interested in such matters. The young man explained that as a Gerda, he would have to go to Winterband himself one day. Beyond the windows, memories surfaced of monsters and knights clashing in the snow. A scene the father brushed aside as nothing unusual, just another day at the border. The father added that the only difference this time was a stop at Burn City on their way back. The young man repeated the name under his breath, recalling it as the city known for its sewers, the place they visited whenever supplies ran low. The father mentioned there had been a troublesome incident during the stop. The young man asked what had happened. The father explained that an infantryman had attacked a company commander. The young man assumed the soldier would have been executed for it. The father corrected him. The commander, the victim himself, had requested a military tribunal instead. The young man wondered aloud why anyone would ask for that, the thought lingering as the scene shifted elsewhere in the estate. Someone entered a room unannounced, apologizing for the intrusion, only for a familiar voice to greet the arrival with surprise. Two knights recognized the young man immediately, teasing him about how much he'd grown before straightening up to greet him properly as young Master Isaac. Isaac studied the two men, and one of them, a knight with a bandaged head and a curious expression, looked back at him. The father instructed the two knights, Fickle and Randolph, to enter, then dismissed Isaac from the room. Isaac obeyed without protest. After stepping out, Isaac paused in the hallway as a voice inside the room urged that the military tribunal proceed immediately. Inside, one of the knights argued that the offender needed to be executed at once to maintain discipline. The father remarked that his impatience was unusual, and the knight insisted it was purely a matter of discipline. The father turned to the second knight and asked directly whether he agreed with that decision. The bandaged knight replied that he was simply following the commander-in-chief's orders, nothing more. Summoning sighed, questioning how he could defend such an order after having his own ear cut off. Footsteps carried someone away from the room in frustration. Outside, someone else moved briskly down the hall, and Isaac's expression remained fixed, his mind clearly caught on everything he had just overheard. The Gerda crest marked their surcoats, a symbol known across the kingdom as the shield that protected it. Those two men were knights of the border fortress Winterband. The one called Randolph carried a bandage across his head, the mark of the man who had suffered through the mutiny everyone whispered about. Footsteps rushed down the hall as a servant chased after Isaac, calling out to catch him. The servant explained he had been searching for Isaac for some time and asked him to follow for a moment. The servant's voice cracked with urgency as he insisted the matter couldn't wait. Out on the fortress grounds, Isaac asked what the trouble was. Standing among the pine trees near the estate, the servant admitted he'd heard the story from one of Nearce's men, then asked if Isaac already knew about the slave trade operating through the sewer. He added that certain men had been taking bribes to look the other way about it. Isaac asked who exactly these men were, his expression sharpening with focus. The name struck him hard, the Knights of Winterband. His eyes narrowed at the revelation. The servant continued, revealing that near the sewer entrance, the body of one of Nearce's men, one of their own, had recently been found. The corpse bore a strange detail. Every part of him had been cut away except for his left pinky finger. Isaac pressed further, asking what came next. The servant hesitated, struggling to find the words. He finally admitted that something had happened that very day, his voice shaking as he spoke. He described waking up to find the severed fingers waiting on his own bed, a warning meant directly for him. The threat had come through his own subordinate, delivered as a message meant to be unmistakable. The demand was simple: if the kickbacks weren't ready within 2 days, there would be consequences. Panic broke through as he realized his own finger would be the next one taken. He begged Isaac to do something, only for Isaac to remind him coldly that he was the one who had put himself in this position to begin with. Isaac shifted the conversation back to the corpse, asking if there had been any witnesses at the time of death. The servant admitted there had been one, though it had all happened in an instant. A single sword flashed through the air. Witnesses said it moved so fast that the fight was already over before they understood what happened. The only detail anyone could recall about the attacker was a bandage wrapped around his head. Isaac stayed silent for a long moment before finally saying he understood. The servant reacted in shock, unable to believe such a serious matter was being dismissed. So simply, Isaac told him not to worry. As he walked past, a masked figure stood waiting near the trees, and Isaac assured him quietly that he would not die. The story unfolded further. When Isaac's father was returning from Winterband, he had brought along the two knights, who had requested the military tribunal, passing through Burn City along the way. During that stop, they visited the sewer, where they murdered a bandit to set an example for the rest. The bandit's description matched the hooded man exactly, tying the incident directly to what Isaac had learned. Isaac clenched his jaw, repeating the title to himself, those so-called Knights of Winterband. He reasoned that if everything he'd heard was true, then men like that weren't protectors of the kingdom at all, but a disease that needed to be cut out. Isaac made his way down into the dungeon, catching a guard off guard who asked what brought the young master to such a place. Isaac asked directly if there was a death row prisoner being held there for mutiny. Inside a cell, a chained prisoner sat with his head lowered. Isaac stated plainly that he had come to see him. A pair of polished shoes stepped across the cold prison floor. He had come here searching for a death row prisoner, and there was only one truth he needed to confirm. The silver-haired man stood before the cell, staring at the darkness beyond the bars. He wondered whether the Knights of Winterband truly had ties to Niers. This prisoner had once defied that very order, and he might be the only one who knew the answer. He asked the shadow behind the bars if he recognized the name Niers. Stepping into the light, the young noble spoke calmly, saying he had only heard that the organization dealt in human trafficking, nothing more. The chained prisoner said nothing, his amber eyes narrowing as he studied the visitor through the dark. The silver-haired noble tilted his head slightly, a flicker of recognition crossing his face. Something about this man felt familiar, though he couldn't place it yet. He pressed further, asking if the prisoner knew about the connection between the sewer and his company commander. The prisoner remained silent for a long moment before his chains dragged against the stone. Then he spoke, warning that he would say this only once. Gripping the bars, he snapped that he knew nothing at all. The noble studied him closely, his blue eyes locking onto the prisoner's face. Quietly, he asked for his name. A smile crept across the prisoner's face as he answered simply that it was Carlson. Recognition struck the noble at once. He said he remembered now, and asked if the man's only answer would be a lie before uttering the name Kyle. The prisoner's expression shattered. His breath caught, and his footsteps faltered against the chains binding him. Composing himself, he demanded to know how the noble could possibly know that name. The story shifted back in time, to when the kingdom's civil war had first begun to spread, and to the moment the name Kyle first entered the noble's memory. That war had started the day the crown passed hands during the succession ceremony for the throne. The second prince, having lost that war of succession, stood cloaked in shadow behind the new king. Bitter and vengeful, he betrayed the kingdom and sided with the empire, orchestrating a massacre at the very ceremony meant to crown his rival. Once the kingdom fell under the empire's control, the people rose up in fury, gathering torches and sparking a rebellion that soon consumed the land in civil war. The leader of that rebel army had been Kyle, a man now trying to live quietly under the name Carlson. His hands trembled in their shackles as he asked how the noble possibly knew. The silver-haired noble answered without hesitation. He had simply read it in a book. The book, titled Chronicles of Villains, lay open on a table, its pages illustrated with portraits of the era's most infamous men. The chapter devoted to Kyle had always drawn the most attention. Among everything written inside, one claim stood out above the rest, that Kyle was a genius destined to become the continent's seventh swordmaster. Seeing him now standing here in chains, the noble found he couldn't disagree. A surge of mana crackled from the prisoner's palm, raw and overwhelming. Such power spoke of years spent honing himself against impossible odds. The noble's mouth curved faintly. He couldn't begin to imagine what this man could become if he ever fully bloomed. His voice sharpened. Such talent had once escaped execution and risen to lead the rebellion in another life. He demanded to know how a stranger could possibly know all of this. The noble replied evenly that it was too early to be surprised, because he also knew something else. That the prisoner was the son of Cat-Ion. The prisoner's eyes flared. He snapped back, asking how someone serving Winterband could fail to recognize the eldest son of House Goethe, insisting that wasn't the question he'd asked. Standing his ground, he demanded again to know who this stranger really was. He pressed further, wanting to know how the noble had learned these secrets, and asked outright if he'd come here to kill him. Unshaken, the noble replied that he was far too self-conscious, questioning why he would ever bother with the son of a mercenary from the neighboring republic. He added coldly that it mattered even less for a bastard who had vanished over a decade ago. The prisoner's expression twisted with disbelief as he asked if the man truly was young. Master Isaac the noble answered plainly that he didn't care whether the prisoner believed him or not, because there was only one thing he actually wanted to know. He asked why the company commanders of Winterband were tied to the slave trade. A single candle flickered beside the rusted chains as the noble spoke again, saying that if the prisoner truly was the young master he claimed to be, then answering should come easily. He took a slow step closer, insisting that fact made it even more reason to answer. Arms crossed, the noble continued, wondering aloud whether the commanders might try to pin all of Niers's crimes onto the prisoner instead. The prisoner sank down, kneeling against the cold stone, weighed down by the truth of what that would mean, becoming a wanted criminal across the entire kingdom. His eyes glistened as the noble added quietly that he wouldn't even get the chance to begin his revenge. The prisoner's hands trembled against his restraints, silence settling over him as the noble watched, remarking to himself that this one wasn't someone he could bend the way he once bent Bill. Then, without another word, he turned and began to walk away. Left with no other option, the noble decided he would have to lure Near's men out himself. Water dripped steadily through a hidden passage as two hooded figures moved quietly down the stone corridor. One of them muttered that something felt off. There was no sign of Near's men anywhere. The other pointed ahead, telling his companion to look. Before them stood the cages, meant to hold the trafficked merchandise, completely empty. Confused murmurs passed between them, wondering if the new head of Near's was planning to shut the whole operation down. A hand reached for the lock on a heavy door, working it open despite the tension in the air. The younger of the two hoodlums flinched sharply, and the older one gripped his weapon tighter as tension spiked, unaware of who waited beyond. Trembling and sweating, a man in a butler's tuxedo stammered out an invitation, urging them to please come inside. Sweat ran down his face as he ushered them forward with shaking hands, forcing a nervous smile. The two hooded men exchanged a wary glance, one wondering aloud if this was truly one of Near's subordinates, puzzled by the servant's uniform. The butler patted down his own coat, showing them plainly that he carried no weapon at all. Cautious but curious, the two men stepped further into the dim hallway, swords still drawn at their sides. Inside, a lone figure sat waiting at a wooden table, arms crossed, a single candle burning between them. One of the hooded men smirked and asked if this was the new boss of Near's, remarking that anyone brave enough to summon them without so much as a greeting must have 9 lives to spare. The seated man said nothing at first, his eyes hidden beneath his dark hair as silence stretched across the table. Then he broke it, asking quietly if he could ask them one thing. A child's voice cut through the dark room as he asked why they had done it. Sweat beaded on the hooded man's brow as unease crept into the room, the mood shifting from mockery to something colder. Startled and confused, the second hooded man barked at his partner, demanding to know why he was suddenly kneeling, and shouted at him to kneel as well. The older one turned back, asking if his partner truly didn't recognize who this person was. The dropped sword clattered against the floor as the boy's voice greeted the fallen men, saying it was nice to see them again. Isaac stood over them calmly, his hood removed, asking if they'd care to share a cup of tea. One of the hooded men froze, recognizing the boy at once, and calling out his name in disbelief, while the other could only stammer, asking if this was truly young Master Isaac. Snow fell heavily over a quiet frontier village at night, blanketing the wooden houses in white. Inside one modest home, a young soldier gripped a heavy pouch, its weight making the coins inside clink together as he weighed it in his hand, clearly startled by how much it held. Randolph sat nearby, watching his companion with a smirk, remarking that the man everyone dismissed as worthless had an unexpected talent for turning a profit. The younger soldier examined a single gold coin between his fingers, satisfied that the sum would finally cover their unit, is food and firewood for the coming month. Grinning, he added that this was only the beginning. Their worn-out swords could be replaced too, and there would even be a little left over to spend on themselves. Coins spilled from one hand into another as shares of the money were divided among the group, the soft clatter of gold marking a rare moment of relief for the struggling unit. Just as the mood lightened, a sharp voice cut through the falling snow, ordering everyone to stop. The two soldiers froze, tension immediately replacing their earlier ease. Standing in the doorway was their commanding officer, addressing the man now identified as Randolph directly, calling him fickle and demanding to know what he had just overheard. His attention shifted to the pouch resting on the table, his hand pressing down over it as he asked pointedly where that money had actually come from. Furious, he demanded an explanation, his expression making clear he already suspected something was deeply wrong with how his men had come into such wealth. Later, over a quiet cup of tea, the commander absorbed the full account of what had happened, the steam rising between them as the truth settled in. Nodding slowly, he admitted he understood. Every man at the table had his own reasons for the choices he'd made, however questionable they seemed. His thoughts drifted to his own father, a stern and unyielding figure who lacked cunning but stood firm as the frontier's unwavering shield, respected precisely for his integrity. He acknowledged that same respect extended to the men before him. Now, even as he recognized the impossible position they'd been placed in, watching soldiers suffer without means to help them. Left with no alternative, he continued, they had resorted to extorting money from bandits just to cover the shortages plaguing their supply lines, all in the name of duty toward his father and their homeland. The bandaged soldier across the table confirmed it eagerly, insisting that was exactly what had happened, hoping the explanation would be enough. The commander sat back, arms folded, his cold demeanor unreadable as he announced he was ready to render his judgment, repeating the word fickle as his gaze sharpened. Then, without warning, he delivered his verdict, the death penalty. The soldiers recoiled in stunned disbelief, unable to process what they'd just heard. Randolph stammered out the words in shock, questioning whether such a harsh sentence was truly what awaited them, while the commander stood firm, stating his father's judgment would be no different and that they would be handed over to a military tribunal. One of the soldiers slammed his hands on the table in desperation, shouting at the young master, demanding to know how he could still refuse to understand after hearing their entire story. The commander's expression darkened as he replied quietly that no, they truly wouldn't understand, his tone suggesting there was far more beneath the surface of his decision than either soldier realized. A frozen battlefield stretched out under heavy snowfall, bodies lying scattered across the ground. A weakened soldier lay dying in the cold, his voice trembling as he asked whether the young master had any real understanding of true hunger, of frostbite tearing away hands and feet, or of watching comrades die because their blades had grown too dull to protect them. The young master answered simply, his expression unreadable. No, he admitted. He had never known that kind of suffering. Randolph lowered his head, accepting the harsh judgment being passed on him, acknowledging that he'd never run short of excuses to justify what he'd done. Sweat ran down his face as he pushed back, demanding to know why no one questioned the kidnapping of civilians instead, insisting that had been Nears' doing alone and that he'd acted without anyone else's involvement. The young master's eyes narrowed sharply as he asked whether Randolph was truly claiming he hadn't crossed the same line. Nears had, refusing to let the deflection stand unchallenged. Randolph flinched at the accusation, then rose to his feet in fury, gripping his sword and spitting out that he never expected a spoiled brat to understand anything about what they'd endured from the very beginning. Nearby, another soldier pressed him further, asking how long he intended to keep sitting there, urging him to stand and remember they were supposed to be the swords of Goethe. Randolph tightened his grip on the blade, declaring that if it meant protecting Goethe, he was ready to do whatever it took. He rose fully, sword drawn, his voice steady as he vowed he was prepared to cut down anything standing in his way. His fellow soldier shouted in disbelief, calling out to him in shock, urging him to think carefully before doing something he couldn't take back. Randolph's expression hardened further as he reasoned aloud that His Excellency still had his other son, young Master Jonas, and that it was better to eliminate a ticking bomb like the one standing before them now. The young master responded by drawing his own blade, aura crackling to life around the steel as he leapt forward, ready to meet the threat head. And Randolph's eyes widened at the display, immediately recognizing that his opponent intended to unleash his aura in the coming clash. As the swords met, the young master's mind raced backward, questioning silently how things had ever spiraled to this point between them. He recalled a memory from before, a lighter moment where Randolph had proudly presented him with a pouch of coin, insisting at the time that everything they'd done had genuinely been for Goethe's sake. But the young master's thoughts turned grim as he considered what they were doing now, gripping his sword tighter with quiet unease. He questioned once more, almost pleadingly, whether any of it could still be called an act done for Goethe. His memory shifted again to a moment when Randolph had once addressed him formally as Company Commander Fickle, seeming to remind him that things between them hadn't always been this hostile. In that earlier memory, Randolph had stood beside him confidently, declaring that if the young master was the sword, then he himself would serve as the shield protecting him. Another memory surfaced, this time of another soldier, Carlson, standing close and reminding him gently of the words Randolph had once spoken, words that now felt like a distant promise being shattered in the present. Fickle's thoughts settled on a single truth: a sword capable of cutting through anything without ever breaking earned the right to be called a masterpiece. But he warned himself that once such a masterpiece developed a will of its own, it stopped being a weapon and became something far more dangerous, a demonic sword acting against its owner's intent. He confronted Randolph directly, demanding to know exactly what he thought he was doing. As their confrontation shattered the calm of the room around them, steel clashed against steel in a burst of sparks. As the two collided, the young master pushing forward with everything he had. Randolph admitted through gritted teeth that he only understood the truth of the situation after his own ear had already been sliced. Clean off, shaken and bleeding, he cried out that Carlson had been right about Fickle all along, the realization crashing over him too late to change anything. A voice cut in, accusing Randolph of losing his mind entirely, warning him that continuing this fight would cost him his head as their blades locked again in a shower of sparks. Randolph pressed forward anyway, muttering that even this violent confrontation must simply be another part of the karma they'd all earned for themselves. As their swords scraped past one another, he added bitterly that they should all just be honest with themselves about what this had really become. The fight paused as the true subject surfaced, the money. It had never been a simple matter, and neither of them could avoid addressing it any longer. Randolph, breathing hard, asked pointedly whether that money had truly gone toward the territory alone, or whether it had served some other purpose entirely. Blood scattered across the ground in the aftermath of a sudden strike, the violence giving way to scattered memories and fragments of a story still unfolding. The scene shifted to a memory, Fickle recalling that this was the exact reason Carlson had drawn his sword in the first place. Randolph explained that when Carlson first discovered the truth, their first instinct had been to silence him, intending only to injure him enough to keep him quiet. Fickle's expression remained still as he pointed out plainly that despite their intentions, Randolph and the others had lost that confrontation to Carlson. Randolph's gaze darkened as he admitted that Carlson could have killed them all right then and there, sparing no one. Instead, kneeling and holding his head in visible anguish, Randolph revealed that Carlson had only told him to open his ears to the truth, then cut off his own ear and submitted to arrest without any resistance at all. Fickle studied him carefully, asking whether it was guilt that had driven Randolph to stop Carlson's summary execution afterward. Randolph offered no answer, only a heavy silence as his footsteps echoed uncertainly across the stone floor, a quiet sound escaping him. Standing with his hands bound behind his back, Randolph's mind turned to his family, dreading what would happen to them if the truth of everything he'd done ever came to light. Fickle sat with his arms crossed, his cold expression unreadable, as he told Randolph that of all people, he would know the truth of the situation better than anyone else present. Randolph's mind spiraled into panic as he clutched the bag in his hands, wondering if something new was about to go wrong and quietly considering whether he should simply make a run for it. Fickle's calm gaze shifted, a faint smirk crossing his face as he watched Randolph's nervous reaction with quiet amusement. Randolph froze in place, addressed directly as Sir Randolph, his body tensing at the sound of his own name. Fickle rose to his feet, standing over him and asking directly whether he intended to atone for his sins through some alternative means, leaving the question hanging heavy in the dim torch-lit room. In a dim stone chamber, a white-haired young man sat bound to a chair. Before him stood Randolph, sword sheathed at his hip, waiting for an answer. He asked the prisoner, Sir Randolph himself, whether he intended to atone for his crimes through any means other than death. The scene shifted to reveal how it began. Randolph and a man named Fickle, tasked with restocking supplies for their company, started dealing with a group known as the Nears, exchanging goods under the cover of night. What started as simple trade turned corrupt. Driven by greed, Fickle took charge of a slave trade operation, using the company's connections to profit from human lives, and eventually forced himself on the maids serving the estate. When his schemes at home ran dry, Fickle turned to Isaac, a young ward of the household, and attempted to sell him off to a foreign buyer, holding him down by force as the boy struggled against a blade pressed near his throat. Before the sale could be completed, a blur of motion cut through the air, a blade flashing in to intervene at the last possible second. The one who struck the killing blow was Randolph, the knight who had sworn loyalty to the household. He stood over Fickle's fallen body, sword still raised, having ended the betrayal with his own hand rather than let Isaac be taken. In the aftermath, all blame was placed on Fickle. His silhouette hung from the gallows, the full weight of the crime settling on a dead man's name, while the truth of who else was involved went unspoken. Later, a hooded figure walked alone through the quiet streets at night, passing others without a word. Under the shadow of his hood, his sharp eyes remained fixed ahead, unreadable, betraying nothing about what he had done or what he intended to do next. Elsewhere, a woman walked briskly past a lit townhouse, glancing over her shoulder as the same hooded figure moved quickly through the street behind her, closing the distance under the glow of the windows above. In a grand study lit by a fireplace, two men sat across from each other in quiet conversation. Even though both company commanders had been swayed by greed, the reason behind their desperation remained real and undeniable. That reason lay plainly on the ground, a torn sack and a few scattered rations. It represented the harsh truth that House Goethe had been forced to confront for some time, a shortage that would not go away on its own. House Goethe held the duty of guarding the kingdom's northern border on behalf of the royal family. In exchange, they received a yearly shield tax, the income meant to sustain the house and its people. but that income had a flaw. Standing before a man seated behind a heavy desk, a young attendant reported that the shield tax had been steadily shrinking year after year, leaving the house with less to work with each season. The man could not complain about this decline, nor could he take any action to build wealth of his own outside of what the crown allowed. House Goethe was bound by restrictions it could not challenge. The reason behind those restrictions went back generations, sparked by a single flame that had once devoured everything in its path. Long ago, a mage-driven mad had, for reasons since forgotten, burned the royal capital to the ground. That mage was Zeke von Goethe, and the shame of his actions had followed the family name ever since. With no one strong enough in the kingdom to stop him, the king had been forced to kneel before the empire for aid. In the end, Zeke von Goethe was captured and executed by the imperial knights. Following that disaster, the kingdom lost its independence and became a vassal state under the empire's rule, a consequence the current generation still lived with. Because of the king's limited mercy, House Goethe had been spared execution. Instead, their ducal title was stripped away, reduced to a mere county, and the family was exiled to this cold, barren territory in the north. That history left the family trapped. If they ever tried to rebuild their wealth, the royal family would immediately suspect House Goethe of plotting treason, and the cup in his hand offered no comfort against a legacy he never chose. In the frozen north, bodies lay scattered across the snow, soldiers cut down mid-retreat, a sword abandoned in the drifts beside them. Keeping the current system in place, even while starved of proper funding, had always been treated as the safest path forward. A young man with dark hair turned his face toward the light, saying nothing at first before quietly admitting that perhaps there was more to consider. In the estate's parlor, he sat across from two older men and voiced a thought that had been building in him, that everything they believed about their situation might just be their own hasty assumption. One of the older men turned sharply, asking if the boy meant that the royal family would simply leave House Goethe in peace, should they start building wealth on their own. The young man pressed on, laying out the truth plainly. The royal family's finances worsened with each passing year, and the shield tax that sustained House Goethe would only keep shrinking alongside it. He continued, reasoning aloud that if House Goethe became self-sufficient and refused the shield tax altogether, the royal family's reaction would reveal everything: suspicion or quiet relief at one less burden to carry. The blonde man, older and more composed, added that the real issue had never been permission. It wasn't that House Goethe was forbidden from building wealth, it was that no one had ever worked out how. Isaac, standing near the window, remarked bitterly that they were boxed in on barren land, hostile powers pressing in from every direction, with no room left to maneuver. The older man rested his chin against folded hands, considering the weight of what had been said, before admitting that the boy's point held up. He went further, saying that even if they found a way to grow their wealth, it would mean nothing without something else behind it. A justification strong enough to survive scrutiny. The young man's expression sharpened, and he stated plainly that he had a way to create exactly that justification. He raised his hand, saying they had to begin somewhere, and that somewhere was cutting all ties with the old church. He explained that as long as House Goethe remained bound to the old church's ascetic doctrines, the family would never be permitted to cultivate real wealth, no matter what they built. The blonde man repeated the idea aloud, uneasy, warning that severing ties with the old church would not go unanswered. The Vatican would not simply stand by and let it happen. The young man agreed that it was true, and added that this was exactly why they needed a justification strong enough to hold against that response. His fist tightened at his side as he declared that he already had a way to create that justification, startling the men around him. An older steward standing near the window turned to another man seated nearby and asked what he made of the plan, addressing him as Schiller. Schiller lowered his teacup, studying the moment, and asked aloud whether such a plan could possibly have come from Isaac's own mind. The steward admitted it was nothing short of astonishing, especially given that the boy had never received proper tutoring, his lessons cut short again and again by uncontrolled bursts of mana. Later, through a tall window, the steward watched two figures cross the courtyard below. A tutor and Isaac walking side by side, while behind him, the words about severing ties with the old church still echoed in his mind. A hand pressed flat against glass, splitting into two versions of the same gesture. The blonde man's raised palm on one side met a darker hand reaching up from below, separated only by the pane between them. The older man stood near the window, hands behind his back, waiting. Time passed in silence until he let out a quiet laugh to himself, something in his thoughts finally settling. He turned toward the tall window, arms lifted as he stretched out the tension in his shoulders, while another man stood a few steps behind him near a small table, watching without a word. Days later, south of Burned City, a carriage rolled through the dark countryside. Its wheels turned steadily along a dirt road as it approached a lone stone church standing beneath the night sky. The carriage came to a stop near the church grounds, its driver seated up front in a wide-brimmed hat, while someone else stood off to the side in the darkness, watching it arrive. A hooded figure emerged from the church doorway carrying a lit lantern. He spoke words meant as ritual, invoking a black calf's entrails as part of some private ceremony being carried out in the night. The man in the wide-brimmed hat stood facing him without a word at first, then answered with a phrase that finished the ritual exchange, saying that joy would toy with him. The hooded man told him to bring forth the gift meant for the person waiting. Moments later, the carriage door was pulled open with force, ready to reveal what was inside. Inside the carriage, a young man with white hair sat bound and gagged, flanked by two cloaked figures holding him steady as the vehicle came to a full stop. He was lifted out and carried toward the church entrance. One of the hooded men asked if the boy was truly the promised sacrifice, and the man in the hat snapped back, asking how he could forget the face of someone he had been hired to deliver. The hooded man leaned down toward the bound boy, lantern raised close to his face, saying that they still needed to confirm his identity for themselves before anything could proceed. He grinned, his expression twisting with anticipation, adding that verification mattered most because of the reward that had been promised to them in exchange for the delivery. The boy said nothing, staring ahead through the cloth covering his mouth. From inside the church, a voice called out that the promised sacrifice had arrived and ordered the servant to bring forward the true gift in return. The voice continued, declaring that the goddess of fire would gladly accept what was being offered. As the church door creaked further open into the darkness beyond, an old man draped in black robes stepped out, leaning on a cane, murmuring that all of this was simply the goddess's will. As he studied the boy standing before him, he gestured toward the open doorway, inviting the group inside with a simple request to follow him, his hand extended toward the darkened interior. Once the exchange was finished, the man in the wide-brimmed hat exhaled sharply and muttered under his breath, calling the men inside disgusting bastards, disgust plain across his face. One of the cloaked men flinched at an unseen chill, catching himself mid-sentence before quickly changing his suggestion from staying to leaving immediately. The three men stood together in the dark clearing, the bound boy positioned between them, all facing forward as they prepared to finish what they had started that night. A lantern swings in the night wind as a gloved hand lifts it high. A quiet voice gives a single order: "Follow me." Hooded figures descend a long stone staircase, lantern light cutting through the dark. A white-haired boy walks between two cloaked men, escorted down toward a waiting group below. The boy's hands are bound behind his back, his hair falling loose as he is led downward. Below, a black-haired man in a hood watches with a hardened, calculating stare. The scene shifts, a caption marks the timeline. A few days ago, steam rises from a cup of tea and a sharp eye watches from above it. On a garden terrace, the white-haired young man sits across from the black-haired man. He asks whether his release came because Randolph and Fickle's crimes were exposed. The answer comes back simple: correct. That is the story they agreed to use. The white-haired man sips his tea and adds a condition. Since insubordination is a serious offense, the other man has been stripped of his position as platoon leader. The black-haired man reacts with silence, only remarking that he never knew the other had been platoon leader. The white-haired man drinks again, then asks if his companion recognizes the tea. He notes it comes from his homeland, the Republic. The black-haired man studies his cup for a long moment before setting it down and asking directly why he wasn't reported. He presses further, noting that the white-haired man knows his real name isn't Carlson. The white-haired man smiles faintly, explaining he kept that knowledge in reserve. If he had exposed it earlier, he wouldn't be able to use him now. The black-haired man's expression tightens with unease. He wonders privately what this kid is really after, admitting he can't read his intentions at all. The white-haired man tells him not to bother guessing his thoughts, and instead to stay focused on his own objective. The black-haired man stiffens, asking how he could possibly know what that objective is. The white-haired man lays it out plainly. He accuses him of planning to kill the greedy old man who slaughtered the family he had worked so hard to build, Viscount Klaus von Bottmer. The black-haired man's eyes flash with shock and fury at hearing the name spoken aloud. He demands to know how the white-haired man could possibly know that, then immediately shifts the question if he knows. Why isn't he trying to stop him? The white-haired man only lifts his cup again and asks why he would. The black-haired man lays out the imbalance between them. The Viscount is a noble of the kingdom. He himself is nothing more than a foreigner with no standing to challenge one. The white-haired man cuts through the tension with a request of his own. He needs a masterpiece sword, one with a will of its own. The black-haired man's gaze sharpens with sudden understanding. He begins to speak, testing the offer if he helps him. The white-haired man finishes the thought for him, calm and certain. He will help him too. The two sit across the quiet terrace table, an unspoken alliance now settled between them. On a city street, a black-haired man watches passers-by move through the square, expression grim as he takes in the scene. A robed priest, flanked by armored knights, roars to a gathering crowd. He declares that black magic is spreading like a plague through Burn City, warning that cultists are violating women and feeding on children. The priest continues his sermon from a carriage window, urging the crowd to practice their faith and seek salvation, insisting they should rely on their God rather than the Lord who merely stands by and watches. Behind a curtain, the black-haired man peers out at the scene below, identifying the group for what it is: zealots of the old church. Beside him, a brown-haired man with a headband scoffs, noting bitterly that the church takes a tenth of what Goethe earns while publicly insulting the Lord. The white-haired young man, seated calmly with arms crossed, cuts off the complaint. He says that isn't what matters right now. The brown-haired man turns to him, uneasy, and asks if he is really certain about this, offering himself up as a sacrifice for the cultists. The white-haired man explains his reasoning. If they only needed bait, anyone could serve the purpose instead of him. But the cultists crave infamy, and there is no sacrifice more likely to draw their attention than himself. The two men beside him fall silent, unsettled, one murmuring that they don't know what might happen once they're inside the cultists' den. Outside, the bald priest continues preaching to the crowd, claiming the cultists might truly be devouring people as rumored, and asking whether the people are certain it is worth risking everything to find out. Inside the hideout, the white-haired man asks for confirmation that the old church stands behind the cult, as previously claimed. A rugged, broad-shouldered man with a scar-lined stare is introduced by name. Nears was likely a cultist himself. The brown-haired man agrees with a low hum, adding that given the cannibalism and black magic surrounding the group, it would be stranger if he weren't. The white-haired man asks Randolph directly whether Nears always handed over the same type of silver coins. Randolph confirms it. Surprised by the question, the white-haired man reveals what he noticed: those coins were minted directly by the royal family, and questions how someone like Nears could have gotten hold of such high-quality currency. The brown-haired man hesitates, murmuring that it is certainly unusual, admitting such coins aren't something Nears or any ordinary cultist should possess. The black-haired man considers the implication quietly, reasoning that it would be possible only if the old church itself were involved, though he questions whether that alone proves any real connection between the church and the cultists. The white-haired man is met with a challenge from within his own thoughts, wondering if he is simply grasping at the slightest hope to justify the theory. A caption marks the moment in time, focusing closely on his sharp blue eyes as the memory continues. The narrative shifts into grim exposition. The cultist group known as the Dark Sect began to eat away at Goethe from within, spreading bizarre murders and mysterious rituals through blood-soaked ritual sites, leaving the citizens of Burn City gripped by terror. A radiant flashback shows the bald priest reaching out to a crowd of grasping hands, bathed in golden light, of everyone who profited from the chaos. The old church benefited the most. The old church hunted down the fanatics of the Dark Sect and held public burnings at the stake in the square, silhouettes writhing in flame before the gathered crowd. Witnesses look on at the burning site, believing they've seen divine mercy unfold before their eyes. The spectacle elevated the old church's reputation across the city. A hand slams down on a table. A voice cuts through the tension, calling the arrangement ridiculous. This is what Goethe had become since then. A black-haired man stands before a council, arguing that doubling the tithes wasn't enough. Now the church wants knights sent for a temple expansion too, despite Winterband being in the middle of a defensive war. A bearded man in a suit rubs his temple, irritated, as the narration notes that Goethe began receiving increasingly unreasonable demands from the old church. As a result, Goethe suffered food shortages and failed to properly defend its fortress. A hand reaches out as a voice declares they will finally cut ties with the old church. This isn't simply about money. A carriage arrives at a quiet stone church at night. The narration explaining that severing that tie is the first step toward truly protecting Goethe. Footsteps echo across scorched ground. An old woman murmurs that everything started here. This was the place the fanatics of the old church once burned to the ground. She continues, saying that 3 saints survived the flames that night. The 3 survivors, marked by burns, unanimously claimed that on the border between life and death, they witnessed the true form of God. A hooded man mutters under his breath that nobody asked for that. A dark caption explains the group's twisted belief. A soul dwells within the human body. By devouring that flesh, they believe the soul is reborn within the one who eats it. The stolen soul carries with it the person's intellect, abilities, and vitality. Even all the pain and joy that soul once experienced in life gets absorbed along with it. This, they claim, is how humans reach eternity. Hooded cultists surround a struggling group, robes rustling as violence stirs beneath layered chanting. One of the men startles, cursing under his breath as danger closes in around them. A ritual reaches its climax. A voice cries out that the prophesied sacrifice has arrived, urging the others to consume the noble soul, the wise soul, and the pure soul to gain those very traits. An old cultist grins with manic joy, declaring they've brought a soul that possesses all three qualities at once and calls for the feast to begin. As the word feast echoes, a hooded figure grimaces at the declaration, refusing to stomach what he is hearing. Moments later, one of the men stumbles into the chamber, groaning in pain as the bound white-haired man sits nearby, and a voice sighs in quiet relief, murmuring that he finally managed to pull it off. Weapons drawn in the dim chamber, one hooded man gives a sharp order to the other, only fight the ones who attack first. A cultist chokes and convulses, collapsing as blood spreads across the stone floor, his hand going still against the broken ground. Amid the chaos, the white-haired young man's eyes burn with focus. He reminds himself not to lose sight of why he came here in the first place. A dark-haired man exhaled in relief, pressing a hand against his forehead as tension left his body. He had finally succeeded. Nearby, two hooded figures moved through the shadows, one gripping a blade tightly while the other gave a quiet order to only strike those who attacked first. An old man collapsed to the ground, spitting curses at the cloaked figures standing over him. He warned that anyone who abandoned the goddess would be struck down by a curse, his voice cracking with desperate anger. A cloaked woman stood over the fallen man, sword drawn and stance calm. She told him plainly that anyone who wished to die was free to take a step closer, her voice carrying no hesitation. More hooded men rushed forward, blood streaking their faces as they screamed and charged. A blade cut through the air toward them, and one figure vowed to end them before they could even register the pain. Footsteps pounded across wooden floorboards as the fight spilled through the building. A wounded man stumbled backward, breathing hard, sword raised as the attackers closed in around him. The commotion faded into silence. A woman stood at the entrance of an old stone building, staring into the empty dark, quietly wondering if the enemies had slipped away. A brown-haired man in a black cloak stood beside a younger companion, both watching the aftermath. When asked whether they should give chase, he refused, saying their priority was to keep searching the area instead. A bandaged man leaned against the stone wall, laughing under his breath. He mocked the idea that someone named Niers had truly been devoted to their religion, calling the believers nothing more than rabble. Kneeling beside a collapsed old woman, a young swordsman asked gently if she was able to stand, his sword resting against the ground beside him. The elderly woman stirred, trembling and disoriented, murmuring softly for someone she called honey, lost somewhere between memory and the present moment. Startled awake, she looked around frantically and begged not to be struck, asking where she was as the young man beside her looked on, confused by her sudden panic. A tall man in a wide-brimmed hat sneered, asking if the old woman had lost her senses. The silver-haired young man beside him said nothing, only watching in silence. Trembling, the old woman begged for mercy, addressing her captor as subdeacon, before quickly correcting herself and calling him ma'am instead. A dark-haired man knelt close to someone lying before him, his expression calm as he asked where their home was located. The scene shifted to a quiet, run-down district on the edge of the city where a modest house stood beneath a darkening sky, the slums south of burned city. Inside, a group of hooded men stared in stunned silence at something glowing before them, one muttering that what they were witnessing had to be some kind of madness. A massive pile of silver coins gleamed inside a hidden chest, prompting disbelief over how an elderly woman could have possibly amassed such wealth. The underground hideout, it turned out, had been littered with bodies, yet somehow, the old woman had kept a fortune in silver coins hidden away in her attic the entire time. Crouched around the open chest, the group debated whether the coins truly belonged to the royal family, someone urging caution before they claimed the treasure as their own. The silver-haired young man studied a single coin closely, turning it between his fingers. There was no mistaking it. The crowned lion engraved on its surface bore the unmistakable seal of the royal mint. The silver-haired young man knocked lightly, listening for a moment before pressing forward. The evidence in his hands connected the group directly to the old church, and he called out to check on his companion, wondering if she was still nearby. He pushed open a door and stepped toward a narrow staircase leading down into a dim room, announcing that he was coming inside. Descending the stairs, another young man peered down from above, calling out to ask if his companion below was feeling well. Startled, the silver-haired man reacted with sudden alarm as a bald priest of the old church stood revealed before him, his robes marking him clearly as a man of faith. The priest's expression twisted into a knowing smile as he asked, almost mockingly, whether the ritual had gone as planned. An old woman sat stiffly on the edge of a bed, murmuring an uncertain response, while the priest standing over her forced a strained, unsettling laugh. Memory returned to him in flashes, eyes wide with recognition. He recalled demons trampling the altar and slaughtering the faithful who had gathered there. Summonon had once begged the apostle for another miracle. The priest, confused, asked what demons they meant, and demanded a full explanation. The old woman gasped for breath, addressing him as subdeacon through her tears, sobbing that her husband was beating her and pleading desperately to be saved. The priest's face darkened with irritation as he muttered under his breath that she was doing it again, clearly no stranger to her outbursts. His eyes narrowed sharply with sudden suspicion as he turned toward the stairs leading up to the attic above. Climbing up, he remarked coldly that there was simply a rat hiding in the attic, power gathering ominously in his open palm. He decided the old woman had outlived her usefulness. If their secret about the hidden coins ever came to light, everything they had built would collapse. Fire bloomed across his hand, swelling into a blazing orb as he declared he would purify the attic and everything in it with holy flame. Beneath his hood, the young swordsman's eyes hardened, recalling an old warning that demons often hid within the light itself. With a blade pressed against the priest's throat, the swordsman ordered him to stay still, warning that any sudden movement would cost him his head. Sweat ran down the priest's face as he demanded to know who had ambushed him, warning that killing him would bring the full weight of the Vatican down on his attacker. Memory struck him at last. His eyes widened in recognition as he stared at the pale cloaked figures standing over him, finally placing where he had seen them before. A cold voice greeted him by name, addressing him directly as Subdeacon Silvio. Stripping away any pretense of anonymity, the silver-haired young man descended the last steps with an easy smile, asking calmly if Silvio had been keeping well, the pleasant tone masking the tension coiled beneath it. A quiet stone chapel stood alone in the forest, sunlight breaking through the trees onto its worn courtyard, untouched by the violence brewing beneath its calm exterior. Bound to a wooden frame, Silvio confessed through gritted teeth that the old church had wanted to expand its influence into Goethe. A corpse lay sprawled across the stone floor nearby. To achieve that goal, Silvio admitted, the bishop had said they needed a villain to blame. A blood-stained ritual circle lay open on a table. Silvio explained that he had crafted a new doctrine built from the old church's own theology, using it to stir vagrants and the poor into forming a religious order of their own. Seated and bound, Silvio stated flatly that this manufactured order was, in truth, the evil cult everyone feared. One of the hooded men remarked dryly that it was the worst confession he had ever heard, then asked his companion what they intended to do with him. The silver-haired young man stood in thought before revealing the plan. The next day, Schiller would escort the subdeacon to the cathedral, where the true negotiations would take place. Silvio, still restrained, sneered that they shouldn't assume they had already won. He warned that even if the Count's scheme had caught them off guard this time, the bishop would ensure Goethe paid dearly for it. Struggling against his bonds, Silvio shouted that he alone had been the one who planned the entire operation from the start. The silver-haired man's eyes turned cold and sharp as he replied that if the church wished to negotiate a price, they would have to come to him directly. Night settled over the chapel grounds, a single candle burning steadily on an old altar as footsteps echoed closer through the dark. Silvio groaned in pain, still tied to the chair, as the pressure of his situation pressed down on him, both physically and mentally. Sneering through his exhaustion, Silvio spat that his captors were nothing more than the spawn of savages, laughing bitterly at his own defiance. A cold voice above him promised that divine judgment awaited him for the sins he had committed. Silvio doubled down, insisting that the bishop would show no mercy, vowing that Goethe and every pagan tied to it would be punished without exception. Blood streaked across his face as the beating continued, his expression twisting between defiance and disbelief at the punishment being dealt to him. Gasping and growling under each blow, Silvio's body slumped further, his resistance finally beginning to break down completely. A boot pressed down as his attacker stood over him silently, the hooded figure showing no reaction to Silvio's suffering. Someone stepped away from the scene, lantern in hand, only to be stopped by a voice asking if he intended to leave so soon. Turning back with a faint smile, the silver-haired young man remarked that it was a shame considering how long it had been since they'd last seen one another, his expression carrying quiet menace beneath the warmth. Cloaked in shadow, Bishop Livonius turned sharply, his hooded face darkening with cold fury as he learned his carefully laid scheme against Goethe had failed completely. Night falls over the estate grounds as footsteps move quickly across the stone path, the sound echoing through the darkness. A group of armored knights escorts a cloaked figure toward an old chapel hidden among the trees, torchlight flickering at the entrance. Two hooded men watch from a tree branch above, one noting that if the young master's suspicions are correct, this group must belong to the old church, sent to silence anyone who knows too much. Inside, a hooded figure walks the stone corridor, admitting quietly that the young master's claims turned out to be true after all. Perched in the tree, the younger of the two watchers repeats the words to himself, unsettled by the mention of the old church. His face tightens as he recalls how the church drained money from Niers, insisting neither he nor his companion Fickle ever knew the full truth of where it went. The older companion beside him interrupts, admitting it wasn't as if they were completely blind to it. He continues, confessing they knew the money was dirty and simply chose to look away, instead of asking questions. Standing on the branch, he warns the younger man that now that he understands what happened, he shouldn't end up like Fickle did. He adds that the young man still has a family to protect, and that fact alone makes his next move heavier than a mission. The younger man's jaw tightens, his fist clenching hard as he forces out a quiet answer that he does understand. With his mind made up, he tells his partner they should focus only on the job assigned to them, as the pair look down at 13 armed men guarding the chapel below. The two step forward together, drawing their blades, agreeing to eliminate every guard so nothing interferes with what the young master intends to do. Deep underground, a blood-stained grimoire lies open atop a glowing summoning circle, and a voice remarks that it never expected to encounter him in a place like this. The speaker is revealed as Bishop Livonius, smiling as he notes that his opponent doesn't look surprised in the slightest to see him there. The bishop laughs to himself, wondering aloud whether the Margrave's son is simply naturally gifted even at such a young age. Across from him, a young man with pale hair and sharp blue eyes reacts sharply as a burst of magical light erupts violently between them. As the spell settles, the bishop observes calmly that his opponent has cast phase shift on the stake, questioning whether that power comes directly from the formula written in his grimoire. The young man stands his ground near the entrance, admitting he is surprised the bishop chose to appear in person rather than send someone else. Before trailing off mid-sentence, the bishop grins wickedly, asking why the young man looks as thrilled as someone who just found a gold coin, then teasingly wonders if that is really how his own expression appears right now. Livonius mocks a bound man before him, expressing false grief over how easily Subdeacon Silvio fell into evil. Flipping through the grimoire, he remarks that at least Silvio was the kind of man who knew how to repay a favor, hinting at a debt paid through betrayal. He lashes out with a burst of dark energy, sneering that Silvio was the one who brought the seed of evil into this very place. The blast tears through the corridor toward Isaac, who stands his ground as the shockwave rushes past him. A second wave follows, and Isaac's sharp blue eyes narrow as the light gathers around his outstretched fingers. A brilliant flash erupts as he redirects the attack, driving the force back down the hallway toward Livonius. The strike shatters against the stone floor inches from Livonius, who flinches, sweat breaking across his face, as shock replaces his earlier smugness. Frost gathers around Isaac's raised hand, faint sparkles drifting off his fingertips as he questions Livonius's condition under his breath. Livonius stares in disbelief that his opponent is wielding ice magic, and Isaac calmly muses that he supposes he must have sold his soul to a demon to gain it. Gritting his teeth, Livonius grips the grimoire tighter and asks Isaac if he still remembers something from long ago. A memory surfaces of the day of Isaac's birth, the bishop's hand gently holding his tiny fingers as he recalls personally performing the baptism himself. Livonius's expression darkens as he admits that back then, he had already been deeply displeased with Isaac's lineage. In the present, Isaac asks whether the bishop is simply reciting history now, and Livonius replies that he knows it as well as anyone does. Livonius states coldly that Isaac must already be well aware of the problem tied to his own bloodline. He explains that most of the cultists gathered here originate from the borderland tribes, barbaric raiders known for pillaging and endless conflict. And yet, he continues, Isaac's father, Count Goethe, once claimed he would broker peace with those very savages. sealing it by marrying one of them, and fathering Isaac as a result. Livonius calls the marriage an unholy union that defies the will of God, declaring it only natural that a curse would follow from it. He tells Isaac flatly that he should never have been born at all. Isaac responds evenly that such words are unusually cruel, especially coming from a bishop. Livonius merely laughs under his breath, asking Isaac slyly whether he already knew what was coming next, revealing the stake meant for a ritual sacrifice and calling the old custom nothing but barbaric. Livonius declares that today Isaac will die at the hands of the evil cultists, insisting this will finally sever the union between Goethe and the savage woman and purify the land. He hurls the flying stakes forward with brutal force, and Isaac braces himself, gathering ice energy in his palm to meet the assault head-on. Sharp ice shards form and launch from his hand, slicing cleanly through the incoming stakes before they can reach him. Livonius grits his teeth in disbelief, realizing his opponent isn't relying on ice alone but accurately intercepting every stake mid-flight, with precise timing. Confused and staggered, he demands to know how such accuracy is even possible, as another stake shatters against unseen resistance. Isaac steadies himself afterward, catching his breath from the strain of holding off the barrage. A memory surfaces of a younger Isaac sparring in a training yard, telling his instructor Lucas he needs to stop for the day. Unable to continue, Lucas teases him for tiring out so soon, while Isaac, collapsed on the ground, insists it already felt like a full hour had passed. Lucas notes that his swordsmanship has grown considerably, recalling how before this, Isaac could never block a single strike from him. Now, Lucas admits with a grin, Isaac managed to block his sword 5 times in a row, though Isaac credits it entirely to having such a skilled teacher. Lucas jokes back, asking why Isaac hasn't pushed him to become a proper knight, instead of wasting his talent staying by his side, brushing it off as just being decently good with a blade. Isaac's expression turns thoughtful as he reflects that what is truly remarkable isn't the swordsmanship at all. It is the vivid detail of his own imagination, conjured entirely within his mind during the years he spent locked away. Back in the present, ice energy crackles around his fist as he wonders why Lucas's old words are surfacing in his memory now, of all moments. He recalls that his imagination was the price he paid for being shut inside that room, unable to see the outside world, and that isolation sharpened his mental focus. During those long stretches of mental simulation, he sparred against an imagined Lucas countless times, eventually manifesting magic he had never been able to use in reality. Through that same imagined world, he envisioned an impossible future for himself, one built entirely from thought. Isaac concludes that the countless experiences inside that imaginary world are what shaped who he has become today. Snapping back to the fight, he lunges forward with renewed resolve, lantern still in hand as he closes the distance toward Livonius. A fierce burst of light erupts from the clash, Isaac's silhouette pushing through the blast as the confrontation reaches its peak. Isaac reflects quietly that Lucas truly was a great teacher, the lessons from that imagined world now guiding his real hand as he reaches forward mid-battle. Standing amid the aftermath, he questions aloud whether this is really the end, remarking that for a bishop to depend on a grimoire just to fire wooden stakes seems far from anything divine. Livonius grits his teeth in silence, sweat forming on his brow as he admits internally that to avoid leaving behind any unique trace, he had held back from using his true authority directly. He concedes that he now has no other choice left, the grimoire glowing violently in his hands. As he prepares to unleash more of its power, raising his hand, he declares for Isaac to behold what comes next as light gathers violently around his fingers. Isaac tenses at the sight, acknowledging aloud that this is the true authority that has been granted to Livonius. Livonius unleashes the attack, screaming out that this is holy fire, a massive blue sphere of flame roaring to life above him. Isaac stares at the blaze, murmuring in disbelief that it truly is holy fire. Livonius laughs triumphantly, confirming it as a flame of purification that ordinary mages could never hope to imitate. He taunts that with this flame, Isaac's precious ice crystals will vanish in an instant, though Isaac calmly asks if he is referring to the ice already shattering around them. A blue flame ignites in Isaac's own palm, mirroring Livonius's power, exactly, leaving the bishop stunned and demanding to know how Isaac could possibly wield it too. Inside a dim stone chamber, a bishop in dark robes stopped short at the sight of a young white-haired man conjuring a swirling blue flame in his palm. He demanded to know how such a flame could be created. The young man answered simply, saying it only took forming a flame and condensing it twice. The bishop's face twisted with fury as he shouted that he was being mocked, insisting that authority over sacred fire could never work that way. The young man conceded that such a rule might hold true for the old church's authority, but noted with a faint smile that he seemed to be something of a heretic himself. He explained that his gift was different from any known church authority, calling it parallel magic. As a searing ball of light gathered and pulsed in his open hand, the power surged upward in a violent column of blue and violet flame, tearing through the chamber as he declared that this was what his magic made possible. The bishop staggered back, eyes wide with shock at the display of raw, uncontrolled power bursting before him. Sweat rolled down his face as he muttered in disbelief, insisting that what he was seeing made no sense. He spat that such divine authority should never belong to the bloodline of what he called a filthy savage. The young man merely raised his hand, smiling, and offered that perhaps God simply favored him more. The bishop's expression hardened into rage, his whole body trembling as the air around him crackled with tension. He summoned his own burning sphere of blue fire, calling the young man's claim outright blasphemy. Roaring, the bishop unleashed a massive pillar of energy, boasting that he had spent decades training his authority to reach this level of strength. As the shockwave tore through the walls, the young man remained standing unshaken. He repeated the bishop's words back with quiet scorn. "Decades, you say?" His sharp blue eyes narrowing. He pointed forward, releasing a devastating blast of violet energy that collided head-on with the bishop's attack, declaring that he himself had trained for an entire lifetime, one far longer than the bishop could imagine. The bishop screamed as the opposing force overwhelmed his own, his magic crumbling under the pressure of power he could not match. The young man lowered his hand and looked at the beaten bishop without pity, saying that out of mercy he would explain the reason the bishop had to die. A single wide eye trembled in fear as the bishop waited, sweat dripping down his face for the answer to come. The young man revealed it plainly. It was because it would be troublesome if word ever got out that he was capable of using magic at all. And with that, a final overwhelming explosion of violet energy consumed the bishop entirely. In the aftermath, a lone figure stumbled through the ruined chamber, bracing against the wall and groaning in pain from the battle's toll. The young man pressed a hand to his chest, breathing hard, admitting to himself that sustaining magic of that scale for so long was still more than his body could comfortably endure. As he turned to leave the wrecked hall behind him, a voice called out from the shadows, addressing him respectfully as young master. A tall, dark-haired young man carried a wounded companion through the ruins of the church entrance, the golden-haired man's blood soaking through his torn coat as they stepped out into the night. The dark-haired man's eyes went sharp with alarm at what he found waiting outside. He demanded to know what had happened, staring down at a scorched, motionless body sprawled across the stone floor. The white-haired young man explained that unlike Bill, this man named Kyle had never signed any contract, and it was best that his own ability to use magic stayed hidden from everyone. He offered a cover story instead, claiming there had been a dispute between the subdeacon and the bishop, and that the two had simply destroyed each other in the process. The dark-haired man studied him for a long moment before asking quietly if he wasn't going to press. For more, the white-haired man merely turned his gaze aside, unreadable. He then reported that he had already disposed of all the paladins, and the dark-haired man answered with a simple word of acknowledgement. The white-haired man fell silent for a beat before asking about someone named Randolph. The dark-haired man's grip tightened on the woman he was carrying, his expression darkening. His hand curled into a fist as he admitted that the man had asked him, before the end, to look after his family. The scene shifted to a quiet gravesite beneath a gray sky, a bouquet of white flowers resting against a stone marker as rain drifted down through the trees. Two men in black mourning coats walked solemnly through the crowd gathered at the funeral, their faces grim beneath the pale light. A veiled woman stood with two young boys clinging to her sides, both children crying quietly as one of them murmured for his father. From a distance, a boy asked how Sir Randolph had died, insisting that his family at least deserved to be told the truth. The white-haired boy standing beside him agreed only that the paladins who had done it were highly skilled. The dark-haired boy's eyes burned with quiet anger as he said that Ralph could have survived. If things had gone differently, the white-haired boy admitted, almost to himself, that he might have survived if he had truly done his best in that fight. The dark-haired boy pressed him, asking if he was saying he hadn't done his best. The white-haired boy answered that he'd had to remain nothing more than an ordinary soldier until the day he could kill the man responsible. He confessed that he intended to keep his true strength hidden until his revenge was complete, even if that meant sacrificing a close friend's life along the way. Facing the dark-haired boy directly, he said he wanted to tell him this in advance, his expression calm and unflinching. He warned that if the same situation ever arose for the dark-haired boy, he would act in the very same way without hesitation, prompting a shocked reaction beside him. The dark-haired boy turned to him, stunned, asking if he would do the same even knowing he was the one helping him carry out his revenge. Standing before a flower-laid grave, the white-haired boy vowed silently that the day would come when he enacted his revenge as Kyle, not as Carlson, and answered with a simple word of understanding. The dark-haired young man looked down at him with a faint smile, saying quietly that the same applied to both of them. Turning away from the church grounds, he added that they were people who had no right to watch a funeral all the way to its end. Later, in a sunlit carriage, an older gray-haired man reported that discussions with the Vatican had concluded, and in exchange for the church overlooking the bishop's crimes, the family had secured concessions. He explained that tithes would no longer be collected and no new bishop would be sent, though he admitted he had no way of knowing how long the Vatican would honor that promise, at least for now, leaving their territory free of the old church's influence. The white-haired young man noted that everything had gone just as planned, and the older man agreed that with the obstacle removed, it was time to move on to the next stage. He added that proper praise would come later, once Carlson himself was present, and suggested they speak of other matters for the time being, leaving the young man visibly puzzled. The older man's expression darkened as he clenched his hands together, insisting bitterly that he had known nothing of what had truly happened. He described the horror he claimed to have only just learned of, that the evil cult's rituals were vicious, that 13 paladins had been brought along, and that the bishop himself had founded the cult and carried out such atrocities without his knowledge. The young man studied him in silence, admitting there was so much he had remained unaware of, despite believing he understood everything. The scene shifted to a memory, the older man gripping the boy's face in alarm and asking what on earth had happened to him, recalling how before he left for Winterband, the boy had merely been a child suffering from a rare condition. But now, he said, he found himself unable to read what the boy was thinking at all, the two studying each other across the space between them. Inside a swaying carriage on a forest road, he admitted quietly that he was simply acting for the good of their house. The two men sat facing each other in the carriage, their expressions unreadable in the fading light. The older man spoke a single name, Isaac, addressing his companion directly. He revealed that he had married a woman named Adele when he was only 14 years old. He recalled that neither of them had shared a common language, that her culture and customs and way of thinking had been entirely foreign to his own, and that she had been a girl of a wild, untamed spirit. He admitted it had been a difficult, almost unbearable time for them both, since they had never been anything more than tools meant to prevent a war between their two peoples. But because of that shared suffering, he said, he and Adele had made a promise to each other. Kneeling before her, he recounted that the promise had been simple. They would never allow their own children to become tools of the house the way they themselves had been. A young officer in a military uniform admitted that even now, the true meaning of life still escaped him. Beside him, a woman with braided silver hair recalled that despite everything, they had promised each other to help their children live lives of their own. Their hands met gently in a quiet moment, sealing that shared promise between them. In the present, the older gray-haired man let out a tired breath, admitting he had planned to tell this story once his son was much older. He looked toward the boy beside him and said that instead, the boy had been forced to grow up far too quickly. He pointed out that the boy wore an expression questioning why he was even being told this story at all. He rested a hand on the boy's head and explained that it simply meant it was still all right for him to remain a child a little longer. The younger boy's face shifted, caught between confusion and quiet realization as he processed the words. After a pause, he answered with a single quiet word of agreement, bowing his head beneath his father's hand. Elsewhere, in a dark forest, a scarred man came running to report to his bald-bearded boss that a letter from Goethe had just arrived. The boss held out his hand without hesitation and ordered the letter be handed over at once. He tossed the sealed letter straight into the campfire, remarking that he had simply been in need of firewood, prompting a shocked protest from the man beside him. He silenced the protest coldly, calling the letter nothing more than a worthless scrap of paper not worth reading. His expression hardened further as he stated that no matter how many times letters like this were sent to him, his answer would remain the same, staring out into the night sky. He declared that those men would never become the true masters of this land, no matter what claims they made. The old count sat behind his desk, hands folded, watching Isaac and Carlson stand before him. He praised them both for their hard work and said he had called them in to reward their service. The count turned first to Carlson, asking if there was anything he wanted. Carlson stayed silent, considering the question carefully. Carlson finally answered. He wished to continue serving Isaac as his attendant, showing no interest in leaving his side. Isaac reminded him that returning to Winterband could earn him a promotion to company commander. Carlson replied that he'd rather find a place where his skills could truly be put to use, brushing aside the offer of rank. The Count tapped his fingers on the desk, weighing the request. He agreed to it, then turned to Isaac, ready to hear what Carlson's role would mean for him. Isaac accepted the arrangement, saying he'd feel more at ease with Carlson as his guard. The Count formally appointed Carlson to the position and granted him 200 denarian. Carlson bowed low and thanked him. The Count then turned to Isaac, telling him it was his turn to name what he wanted. Isaac hesitated before speaking. He asked for Fickle's land. The Count's brow lifted in surprise. He asked if Isaac meant Winfeld, clearly caught off guard by the request. The scene shifted to a training hall bathed in morning light, where a younger Isaac stood across from Winfeld, wooden swords in hand, preparing to spar. The swords clashed hard, wood cracking against wood as the two exchanged a fierce opening strike, the force of it staggering both fighters back. Winfeld ended up on the ground, having blocked the blow but lacking the strength to hold his stance. Isaac stood over him, telling him plainly that his defense was solid, but his footing still wasn't enough. Winfeld wiped sweat from his face, breathing hard from the exchange. Isaac watched him with a calm, appraising look, unshaken by the effort it had taken. Catching his breath, Winfeld asked why Isaac had suddenly requested this spar in the first place, suspicious of his motives. Isaac's wooden sword struck down onto the ground, his answer coming plain and direct. He intended to take hold of Winfeld himself. Winfeld asked what Isaac planned to do once he had control over him. Isaac refused to explain fully, only saying it would serve his revenge, and that Winfeld didn't need to know more than that. The two squared off again in the training hall, swords raised, tension building as they circled each other under the pale light. A fist drove forward, and the wooden blade shattered against the ground in an explosion of splinters and dust, the force behind the clash undeniable. Their swords locked mid-strike, sparks of impact flashing between them. As neither one gave ground, the fight reaching another peak. Isaac steadied his stance, sword raised, and spoke calmly through the storm of dust settling around him. Then let's begin again. Winfeld swung with force, thoughts racing that he'd been told Isaac never learned the sword, yet the clash rang out with brutal impact. Watching him move, Winfeld noted the strangeness of it. Isaac's technique wasn't sharp or fast by any measure. Nothing about it looked impressive on the surface. And yet every attack and every defense landed with perfect precision, as if he'd calculated each motion before it happened. Winfeld reasoned that this kind of skill should only be possible for someone who'd held a sword since the age of 5 or 6. But Isaac's stamina was far too weak to match that history. Something didn't add up. Winfeld stumbled back from another exchange, breath ragged, the question burning in his mind: how in the world was any of this possible? Isaac's eyes narrowed as he stayed silent, gripping his wooden sword and pushing forward again, closing the distance without hesitation. Winfeld's eyes widened in alarm, sensing the attack coming and bracing himself against it. The blades collided again with a violent crack, both fighters driven back by the force of the exchange. Their swords locked, trembling under the pressure. Winfeld grunted through clenched teeth, refusing to yield ground even as his arms shook, caught off guard by Isaac's follow. Through, Winfeld staggered backward, disbelief flashing across his face at the shift in momentum. Isaac drove forward with a fierce strike, and the two collided again, wooden blades crashing together in a blur of motion. Winfeld cried out as the impact landed, pain twisting across his face as he was thrown off balance. Isaac stood over him afterward, calm and unshaken, and told him plainly that this level of skill wouldn't even be enough to get by in Winfeld. Struggling to sit upright, Winfeld admitted the reason behind it all. He was asking Isaac to teach him. Isaac's gaze sharpened as he studied him for a moment, then asked if Winfeld could use magic. Winfeld confirmed it wasn't the paladins who'd taken each other down as he'd claimed. In truth, he hadn't been strong enough to defeat the bishop himself. Isaac asked how Winfeld could tell, and Winfeld explained that once someone reaches a certain level, whether through magic or aura, they can gauge an opponent's strength just by sensing it. Winfeld pressed further, asking if Isaac was really in a position to claim he'd reached that level too, having assumed all along that Isaac was hiding his true skill. Isaac countered, asking if Winfeld had already known his strength back when he wiped out the paladins single-handedly. Winfeld exhaled, unable to deny it. The two stood alone in the empty courtyard, the massive stone archways surrounding them silent and still, with no prying ears anywhere near to overhear what they were about to discuss. Isaac admitted that using magic would make things easier for a while, but doing so would politically isolate Goethe from the rest of the nobility. Winfeld pressed further, and Isaac explained it was because his special constitution matched that of a certain 10th-class mage, leaving Winfeld visibly confused by the term. Winfeld asked if he meant Zeke von Goethe, and Isaac confirmed it, noting that Zeke was the only 10th class mage in recorded history. Isaac continued, explaining that according to the records, Zeke had also suffered from mana explosions, but overcame it by collecting artifacts from across the continent and wearing them on his body, finding his own way past the Constitution's limits. Winfeld asked what that meant for him, clearly unsettled by the implication. Isaac told him that the fact he could use magic at all must be proof that he had overcome that same Constitution. He added that it was just like Zeke von Goethe, and told Winfeld to think it over. Winfeld nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of the comparison. Isaac reflected that it had been over 100 years since Zeke von Goethe burned down the royal capital. Yet someone with that exact same constitution had now been born into House Goethe again and had overcome it once more. He wondered aloud whether the royal family and other nobles would simply leave Goethe alone, concluding they would either try to use them politically or attempt to have him assassinated. Winfeld, catching his breath and leaning on his sword, asked Isaac if he regretted joining House Goethe. Isaac answered plainly. Yes, he said, he did regret it. But he added that he didn't look back, leaving Winfeld staring at him in confusion. Winfeld warned that Isaac would be the one regretting it, not him. Isaac struck forward again, explaining simply that it was because Winfeld had requested a spar with him. Winfeld startled, shouting for him to wait, insisting he thought the spar had already ended. A month passed, and a line of carriages and wagons rolled through the snow-covered roads, journeying steadily onward. Inside one carriage, Schiller asked if it was really alright to leave for Winfeld without saying a word, noting that Hans and Gisela would be sad. He added that Isaac wasn't usually the type to care about such things, and asked why he was bringing it up. Now, Schiller answered his own question, saying it was because the young master did care. Isaac said nothing, only resting his chin on his hand, lost in thought as he stared out at the passing snow. His mind drifted back to the moment he had ignited that purple flame. He recalled feeling that his vessel would struggle to endure anything beyond that point, the strain of the power still fresh in his memory. Isaac admitted he still couldn't fully control the mana explosions building inside him. Schiller replied plainly that having them sad was far better than having them dead. Two black crows perched together on a branch deep in the forest, watching over the quiet road as Isaac's thoughts settled on, wanting no chance of that danger ever reaching them. Isaac rode ahead through the woods on horseback, cloak trailing behind him, coming across scattered bones and a broken cross half buried in the dirt. Schiller explained that Winfeld, once Fickle's manor, was now a place poisoned by the blood of monsters, a land where nothing could grow or take root again. Isaac listened, resting his chin on his hand, and noted that it was also the first place to face any enemy that slipped past Winterband. The description matched the same broken sight he remembered from his past life. A horn blast cut through the air, and Isaac's eyes snapped open in alarm. Someone shouted that the sound meant monsters had appeared nearby. A soldier burst through the carriage door, warning the young master that monsters were closing in and pleading with him to stay inside, no matter what. Isaac froze at the sight before him, stunned, demanding to know why this person was here at all. Hans stood in the driving snow, spear gripped tightly in both hands, bracing himself against the storm and whatever was coming for them. A carriage rolls through a frost-covered forest, the trees bare and pale under a cold sun. A man steps out and calls a single name into the silence. Hans inside, a study. A silver-haired young man snaps at an older attendant, demanding to know why he has come here. The older man only lets out a strained groan in response. The young man's eyes narrow as static tension crackles between them, the older attendant sweating under his glasses. Caught off guard by the sudden confrontation, a servant complains that this old man has been a constant nuisance day and night, questioning why he must keep tolerating him. He presses the older man about whether he can truly be trusted to keep the young master's secret, and the older man wipes his brow, saying nothing. On the road outside, a guard grips his weapon tightly, declaring that no servant would ever abandon his master. He vows to protect him no matter what comes. Back at the carriage, the young master rubs his temple, letting out a tired breath, as if bracing himself for something he already knows is coming. A cry rings out through the trees, a warning that hellhounds have appeared, and the group must form up immediately. The beasts emerge from the mist, their eyes burning red, their jaws splitting into jagged grins. These are hellhounds, demonic beasts known to stalk the region of Winfeld. The creatures are cunning hunters, always singling out the weakest target first. A guard on horseback shouts in alarm at the sheer size of the monsters closing in. Realization strikes as the group understands who the hellhounds have marked as their prey, just as a beast lunges forward with a violent tear through the ground. A rider surges forward on horseback, cloak snapping in the wind, his dark eyes locked onto the incoming threat with sharp focus. A shout cuts through the chaos, warning that the beast is charging straight for the young master's carriage. A guard braces himself in front of the attack, gritting his teeth as the impact bears down, his hand catching hold of something in the same instant. The carriage is surrounded, the hellhound looming just above it as the old attendant and the silver-haired young man huddle low, the guard sprawled protectively in front of them. The carriage is struck head, on the impact tearing through it in a blinding flash of light and splinters. Wreckage crashes down around them as the old attendant shields the young master's body with his own, the young man barely conscious beneath the debris, groaning in pain. A voice cries out desperately into the ruined wreckage, calling Hans's name again and again. Kneeling among the broken beams, the attendant mutters bitterly to himself, wondering if he is about to lose someone else, dreading what the wreckage might reveal. A pair of sharp eyes flicker open beneath the rubble, and a pained groan escapes from the crushed remains of the carriage. Struggling to his feet, the guard reassures his young master that he is still here, and that thanks to everyone protecting him, he was spared from the monster's attack entirely. Snow whips through the air as a fist collides with the guard's face, the strike sending him sprawling under the storming wind, and the young master's furious gaze blood trickles down his cheek as the guard forces out a strained laugh, muttering that this hit had turned out harder than he expected. The young master's fist trembles, his eyes locked on the man before him, the word "you" caught halfway in his throat. Tears mix with blood on the guard's face as he turns toward the young master and offers a quiet apology, kneeling before him in the snow. The old attendant approaches, asking if they are both all right, his sword still stained from the fight, while the young master simply murmurs the guard's name, Carlson. Walking away from the hellhound's corpse, a dark-haired rider asks whether it was Carlson who killed the beast, his tone calm despite the carnage behind him. He turns back toward the group and asks about the other beast still lurking nearby, prompting a hesitant response before the guard trails off. Explosions of light and steel erupt in the distance as the young master turns his head sharply, wondering aloud what could be happening over there. The dark-haired rider explains that the soldiers must be finishing off the remaining beasts on their behalf, identifying them simply as the soldiers of Winfelt. Watching the chaos unfold, the rider notes it seems the Winfelt soldiers have already handled the rest of the beasts for them. A muscular, half-naked warrior tears through a hellhound with his bare hands, prompting a stunned remark that these soldiers fight completely unclothed. The bald warrior throws his head back in wild laughter after finishing off his kill, blood and dust scattering around him as the group watches, unnerved. The silver-haired young master mutters that these people are insane, while his companion agrees flatly that they are completely insane. The old attendant explains that the laughing man serves as commander of the Winfelt camp, prompting a puzzled question about his rank. He adds that most of the soldiers stationed here, including their commander, come from the fighter tribe, a detail that draws a curious echo from the young master. The commander stomps forward, remarking with amusement that it looks like his little sibling has come to visit, his bare foot slamming down beside the group. The attendant coolly corrects him, stating he is the head steward, not his sibling, before asking if he ever received a certain letter addressed to someone named Bessemer. The commander scratches his head in confusion, asking what letter he is even talking about, while another voice teases that he probably tossed it aside without ever reading it. Noticing the young master for the first time, the commander asks who this child is, remarking that his face looks strangely familiar, and the attendant introduces him as young Master Isaac. The commander leans in, eyeing him with surprise, asking if this could really be the same small boy who used to cry so easily. The commander leans closer, marveling at how the boy grew this tall before catching himself and telling him to put some clothes on first. Elsewhere in the camp, soldiers shout orders across the yard calling for the wounded to be brought in, while others drag the fallen beast carcasses aside. The old attendant continues explaining that the young master has now become the official lord of Winfelt, the words landing heavy in the cold air. The commander sits with his weapon across his lap, muttering the word fickle under his breath, clearly unimpressed by the news. He adds bluntly that this young master will end up dead just like his brother before him, his expression unreadable as he says it. The young master watches him in silence, unmoved by the remark, noting quietly that the commander doesn't seem all that sorrowful about it. The attendant explains that the young master has only come to inspect Winfelt briefly to make sure his stay here goes smoothly, which prompts the commander to ask flatly if he actually intends to stay. A hand rises, pointing forward as the young master admits he is still a little confused about everything unfolding around him. A rough voice questions, whether this is truly the crippled child cursed by misfortune, sizing him up with open doubt. The commander rises to his full height, asking again if his name really is Bessemer, wondering aloud if he has gotten it wrong. The young master's expression hardens, saying nothing, only staring back in cold silence at the accusation. The commander corrects himself immediately, admitting the boy is right before letting out a booming laugh. He crouches down to the boy's level, warning him plainly that he should leave now while he is still willing to let him go peacefully. With a scarred face, he adds that here on this battlefield, they have no patience to babysit a cursed fool. The attendant shouts his name sharply, calling out to Bessemer as tension crackles through the clearing. Bessemer only lets out a short, mocking laugh in response. Unfazed by the warning behind the shout, he tells the young master that if he tries to drive him out, this entire camp will fall apart before long because the Wolf King is coming. Gripping his axe tightly, he demands to know what a boy like him could possibly understand about a threat like that. The young master's eyes narrow as the axe swings down toward him without warning. Standing his ground, he declares that he has already cut down a wolf king with this very axe before warning the boy to watch his mouth. The commander calls out to Carlson by name, halting his blade mid-swing as the young master stands frozen just behind him. Sweat runs down the commander's face as he grits his teeth, muttering that he doesn't understand how the boy managed to get this close without him noticing. Isaac steps forward calmly, telling Bessemer that whether he chooses to believe him or not is entirely his own decision. He continues, stating plainly that if anyone stands in his way while he protects what belongs to him, he has no choice left but to remove them. Bessemer bursts into laughter, remarking that despite being crippled, the blood of two great figures still runs through the boy's veins. Isaac responds simply that it is exactly as he says, drawing his blade with a steady hand. He declares himself as Isaac von Goethe, heir to the bloodline of Adele, the great chieftain's daughter, his voice carrying quiet authority through the frozen woods. The head steward looks on with a faint, knowing smile, announcing that Isaac now challenges Bessemer to a formal duel, raising his sword high. Isaac states that once he defeats him, he will personally take command of this camp, while Bessemer's expression twists into open fury at the declaration. A hulking, bearded man loomed over the camp, a savage grin spreading across his scarred face. He mocked the boy in front of him, calling him a fool with a death wish for daring to challenge him. A gray-haired guard flinched in alarm as the white-haired young master accepted the brute's provocation without hesitation. The guard called out the man's name in warning, but it was too late to stop what had already been set in motion. The towering fighter pointed toward the sky, declaring that the duel would take place the next day at noon, the moment the sun reached its highest point back at camp. The young master's cold blue eyes studied the massive man standing before him. Despite the danger, he offered him lodging in a tent for the night, treating the confrontation as nothing more than routine business. The two stood face to face beneath the bare winter trees. The brute told him plainly that if he wished to flee, now was his chance. But the boy's expression didn't waver later that night. The older guard confronted the young master inside his tent, demanding to know what had possessed him to provoke such a dangerous man in the first place. A refined, sharp-eyed official spoke up, revealing a crucial detail. The man called Bessemer was no ordinary soldier. He was a berserker. The official continued, explaining that berserkers were known for their uncontrollable aggression, a trait that usually cut their lives short. Yet somehow, Bessemer had defied that fate and survived far longer than most of his kind. The young master, calmly sharpening his blade, was asked if he understood the weight of that fact. He replied that surviving as a berserker meant Bessemer possessed not just raw strength, but also the discipline to temper it with patience and judgment. The older guard's face tightened with unease. He admitted that the young master clearly understood the danger, and yet asked why he still chose to walk straight into it. Outside the tent, two other soldiers, Hans and Carlson, stood uneasily nearby. A voice called out to them, urging them to speak up and add their own objections to the young master's reckless decision. Hans hesitated, staying silent as another man ruffled his hair dismissively. The young master, unmoved, dismissed them for the night, stating he needed to rest before the coming duel and telling Hans to return with Schiller the next day. Hans looked visibly shaken, stammering out a request for pardon, clearly wanting to protest further, but unsure how to say it. The young master cut him off flatly, telling him he was in the way. Hans froze, caught off guard by the blunt dismissal. The two soldiers stepped back through the tent flap, disappearing into the night outside, leaving the young master alone with his thoughts. Just outside, one of the dark-cloaked men murmured quietly to himself, vowing that if the young master were ever truly put in danger, he would not simply stand by and watch. Lying down for the night, the young master added a final warning of his own. Once that moment came, nothing anyone said would be able to stop him from acting. In response, the older guard simply told him to suit himself, and the two settled into their separate beds, the tension between them still unresolved. Later, another dark-cloaked figure asked Carlson if they were moving out already. Carlson confirmed it with a single word. Carlson reported strange activity stirring among the soldiers in camp. The young master, unconcerned, told him to leave it alone and focus only on the task he'd been given. Under the night sky, a dark-haired man gave a quiet nod, accepting the order handed down to him without question. Morning broke violently. The young master woke with a start. Blood streaked across his forehead and cheek, his expression frozen in shock. He sat up in bed, disoriented and bloodied, staring ahead in stunned silence as his sheets lay soaked around him. Above his bed hung the corpse of a hellwolf, tied to the tent's ceiling beam, dripping blood steadily onto him as he realized it had been placed there, deliberately, dismissed by those responsible as nothing more than a prank. Outside, a soldier tore open the tent flap and shouted in alarm, calling out for the young master as daylight spilled into the wrecked interior. A group of soldiers stood nearby laughing, mocking him openly and asking if he'd feasted on wolf meat the night before. Furious, Hans stepped forward and demanded how men who called themselves soldiers of Goethe could commit such an act, only to be cut off by another voice, ordering him to stop. Ignoring the tension around him, the young master rose and said the real priority now was simply washing the blood from his skin. Hans turned toward him, calling out his title, his face tight with worry. At the wash bin, the young master poured bucket after bucket of cold water over his head, rinsing the blood away in silence, his composure unshaken despite everything that had just happened to him. Schiller stood outside the tent, demanding how men who claimed to be soldiers of Goethe could stoop to something so vile. Another figure told him to save his breath, since confronting the culprits directly would only earn him denials. The older commander stormed onto the scene, furious, demanding to know where Carlson had gone and questioning what he'd been doing while this humiliating prank was carried out. The young master, now calm and composed at the washbin, spoke up in Carlson's defense, explaining that he had simply been away completing a task given to him personally. Toweling off his damp hair, he remained unnervingly steady, prompting the voice beside him to admit disbelief at how unshaken he seemed by the entire ordeal. A memory surfaced instead, one from long before, drawing back to another investigation that had followed the aftermath of an evil cult's rituals. A place once searched for the full truth behind that earlier incident. What they had found there was described simply as nothing short of hell, a scene soaked in blood and dark ritual markings that no one could forget. It was noted that an ordinary child faced with something so horrifying could easily have been shaken into madness. And yet, the young master had walked through it all without breaking later. The older commander approached again, finally locating him and calling out his name as he crossed the muddy campground. The commander remarked that the tent had been quite a sight, yet seemed relieved there had been no serious harm done. The young master coldly repeated the words back, pointing out that he had been left covered in blood and filth. The commander pressed further, asking if it wasn't fortunate that was all that happened. The young master's only response was a flat question, asking him to repeat what he'd just said. The head butler questioned aloud whether Winfeld truly belonged to Goethe, since the land had only ever been claimed by force. His face carried unease as he considered the weight of that question. A group of warriors stood beneath the night sky, one of them reminding the head butler that the men still bowed their heads, only because His Excellency remained alive and in good health. The butler's silence answered for him. The white-haired young master sat by a bathhouse, dismissing the matter, and turning to Carlson, asking what had come of the order he had given. Carlson confirmed that everything had unfolded exactly as the young master predicted. The butler pressed further, revealing that the hellwolves had struck the camp, and not merely out of hunger for food. He questioned whether the young master had deliberately entrusted Carlson with investigating the wolves, sensing there was more behind the decision, standing alone near the camp's wooden walls. The young master wondered quietly what reason could lie behind it all, his expression unreadable as snow drifted around him. A massive blow cut through the air as a giant axe swung down, the impact echoing through the camp. The young master and his men watched grimly as the confrontation began to unfold before them. The young master's sharp blue eyes narrowed as the noon drum sounded across the fortified camp. Before him stood a towering warrior gripping a battle axe, the two facing each other in the open yard. The bald-bearded giant mocked the young master for stepping forward, instead of fleeing, taunting that it still wasn't too late to turn back and run. Unshaken, the young master lifted his sword, declaring that before anything else, they needed to settle exactly how the duel would be carried out. He proposed that the method used by the Waiter tribe to select its chief should decide the outcome, cutting his own palm as a gesture of the tradition's seriousness. The giant's eyes tightened at the sight, acknowledging that the young master had clearly studied the tribe's customs and come fully prepared for the challenge ahead. With a fierce battle cry, the giant swung his axe in a wide, powerful arc, the blade cutting through the air toward his opponent. Blood dripped from a wounded hand, the injury marking the price already paid before the true clash had even begun. The giant reached down and took the young master's small hand in his own massive grip. The disparity between them, stark as the two, stood connected before the fight's climax. Back among the onlookers, a nervous attendant asked Carlson if he intended to save the young master, startled when Carlson replied plainly, asking who else there was to save. The bandaged attendant panicked, crying out that this was nothing short of a fight between a giant and a child, sweat running down his face in fear for the outcome. Carlson turned on him instead, coldly stating that he was a failure as an attendant, leaving the man stunned and struggling to respond. The young master's cold, focused expression cut through the tension as he told them sharply to stop making a fuss and simply watch what was about to happen. A powerful gust tore through the trees as the giant charged forward, axe raised, closing the distance across the snow-covered ground toward his smaller opponent. With a single decisive strike, the giant's massive frame was sent flying backward through the air, crashing down in a burst of light as the young master stood firm, having ended the duel in one blow. The giant swung his massive fist and axe together in a brutal downward strike, roaring as he threw all his strength into the blow meant to end the fight. Carlson turned to the sweating attendant beside him and told him to look closely, both watching intently as the clash unfolded before them. Carlson thought about what kind of man his master truly was, recalling his sharp resolve before an image surfaced of the young master's face streaked with tears. A massive explosion of dust and force ripped through the ground, sending shockwaves outward as the surrounding warriors flinched and shielded themselves from the blast. The attendant stammered in disbelief as he realized what had happened. The young master had blocked the giant's axe head on, standing firm against the crushing weight of the strike, leaving everyone stunned at the sight. Steel met steel in a shower of sparks as a massive weapon crashed down again and again. A young man in a dark coat took the brunt of the impact, thrown backward across the frozen ground, his sword barely holding against the force bearing down on him. Two soldiers stood frozen at the edge of the clearing, watching the scene unfold. One turned to the other in disbelief, unable to process what he had just witnessed. The young master had stopped Bessemer's attack cold, and it made no sense. House Goethe was known for producing mages, not swordsmen. The bald, bearded warrior lowered his massive axe onto his shoulder, sizing up the boy who had just blocked his blow. He dismissed it without much thought, muttering that it must have been luck, nothing more. The young man, silver-haired and breathing hard, knelt on the ground with his sword still gripped tightly in hand. He turned the words over in his mind, unwilling to accept them so easily. Luck alone couldn't explain what had just happened, and he knew it. Back among the soldiers, tension spread fast. One of them called out to his companion, demanding answers about what they had just seen the young master do. The words came out in a rush, the shock still written plainly across his face. Elsewhere, a dark-haired man watched from a distance, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. He turned the mystery over in his head, wondering just how the boy had managed to use magic without anyone catching him casting it. The story rewound to a month earlier. In a quiet training ground, the silver-haired young master stood before an older swordsman, his expression set and serious. He asked directly what it would take to defeat him in swordsmanship. Within the span of a single month, the two faced each other, wooden practice swords in hand, inside what looked like an old chapel hall. The instructor answered without hesitation that it was impossible, that the young master didn't stand even the slightest chance. But the boy pressed further, asking what would happen if losing simply wasn't an option, if he had to win no matter what. The instructor raised 3 fingers, laying out his terms plainly. There were 3 conditions that would need to be met for such a victory to happen at all, and he asked the young master to listen closely. The bearded axe wielder, established now as the very man who would later attack him, spoke through memory. The first condition was clear. The enemy needed to be looking down on his opponent, distracted, careless in his confidence. The same giant of a man knelt slightly, taking the boy's hand as if sealing an agreement. The second condition followed close behind. The fight needed a specific defined victory condition. something concrete to aim for rather than a vague notion of winning. Back on the castle grounds, the dark-haired instructor pointed a finger straight at the young master, driving his final point home. The last condition, he said, was the most important. The boy needed one sure move, something absolute, that could guarantee victory the moment the opportunity presented itself. The instructor added a catch. Meeting all three conditions would mean dedicating every waking hour of the month to nothing else. The young master, unbothered, remarked dryly that his teacher had quite the roundabout way of calling something impossible. Still, he decided it was worth attempting. Time moved forward. A blinding clash of light burst across the training field, twin streaks of energy colliding in a brilliant explosion, sparks scattering into the dark. In the middle of it, the young master gripped his sword, tight muscles tensed. His eyes locked on his opponent as the force of the collision rippled around him. Something had changed in the way he moved. On the ground, panic flickered across the older swordsman's face as his own weapon was sent flying from his grip. He stared at his empty hand, demanding to know how his strike had been turned aside so completely. The young master only looked up at him, a faint knowing edge in his gaze. The answer came in fragments, laid out over the image of a gleaming blade wrapped in shimmering light. It was, he admitted, a trick, nothing more. Beating a trained soldier through raw skill and force alone was never realistic. But there was a problem. No one could ever find out that he was a mage. The scene shifted back further to a private dust-filled room. The young master stood alone, flipping through the pages of a heavy, worn grimoire, quietly explaining the method he had devised to solve that very problem. The book belonged to Bishop Livonius, a grimoire built around phase shift magic capable of launching deadly stakes. He described tearing pages directly from its bindings and gluing them into the inside of his sword's scabbard, hidden from sight. The final piece came together in his own words. By channeling mana through the blade, the grimoire's embedded formula activated on contact, and the sword itself carried out the spell, turning an ordinary blade into a weapon no one would ever suspect was magic at all. The sword hovering in his grip was not truly held at all. Suspended in mid-air through phase shift magic, it only needed to look convincing enough for anyone watching to believe his hand was doing the work. The real difficulty revealed itself the moment the plan was set into motion. The blade was, in the most literal sense, simply floating there, disconnected from his hand, and that alone created a problem no ordinary swordsman would ever have to solve. To make the sword appear as though it were being swung with real force, he had to move like a puppeteer working invisible strings, guiding a weapon that responded to magic rather than muscle. Every motion had to be shaped by a second spell layered on top of the first, controlling the blade's path with a precision that left no room for hesitation or error. The mana powering it all had to be measured with exact balance. Too little, and the sword would fail to move convincingly; too much, and the illusion would break apart in an instant. His eyes stayed locked on his opponent the entire time, tracking every twitch and shift because the illusion could only hold together if his timing matched his opponent's real movements. Across from him, the axe-wielding warrior surged forward, his massive frame closing the distance fast. The young man noted the placement of his opponent's feet, a small detail that told him everything about what was coming next. He read the motion building in the man's shoulders next, the subtle shift that came just before the swing, a signal most fighters would never think to look for. From those two details alone, he could already calculate where the axe would land seconds before it moved. This part, he thought, wasn't the hard one. The real skill had been built long before this fight in countless quiet nights spent alone, running imagined battles over and over in his mind until every scenario felt familiar. Now, factoring in the raw force behind Bessemer's swing as the axe came down toward him, he ran the final calculation needed to counter it. He adjusted the mana output flowing into the blade, tightening his grip as the enchanted sword responded, ready to meet the incoming strike with exactly the force required. The blade connected, and Bessemer's axe was knocked violently off course, sparks and light exploding outward from the impact. As the bigger man stumbled back, fury twisted across Bessemer's face as he steadied himself, spitting out an insult at the boy who had just turned his own strength against him. He shouted at the young man to stop dragging things out and simply fall, swinging his axe again with even greater force behind the blow. From the sidelines, the watching soldiers grew uneasy. One of them questioned whether Bessemer was taking the match too seriously, urging him to calm down since it was supposed to be nothing more than a sparring match. Bessemer's only response was a snarled command to be quiet, his temper completely unraveling as the fight dragged further from his control. The young master's blade cut forward in a burst of light and motion, his expression sharp and unwavering, as he began to speak, warning that anyone who dared interfere with what was happening now would face the consequences. He finished the thought as his sword clashed again, declaring that no one had the right to disrupt what both sides had agreed was a sacred duel between them. The final strike tore through the air, a streak of motion and color marking the end of the exchange, leaving the outcome of the duel hanging in that single decisive blow. The bearded warrior roared down at the boy on the ground, his voice thick with rage as he swore the axe would tear him apart. He raised the weapon high overhead, ready to bring the fight to its end in a single crushing blow. In that instant, a thought cut through the young master's mind. Crossing weapons with Bessemer had taught him something important about the man standing in front of him. He recalled Carlson's blade from an earlier encounter, remembering how much heavier and more refined that weapon had felt compared to what he now faced. A surge of certainty rose in him. He realized, with sudden clarity, that this fight could actually be won. The axe came down in a wide, brutal arc, closing the gap between them. As the young master braced himself, sword raised to meet it, Bessemer's eyes went wide. The moment the blades connected, disbelief flashing across his face as he watched his own axe begin to slip from his grip. The weapon spun away and struck the ground, embedding itself in the dirt, useless now, out of his hands entirely. Both groups of soldiers watched from a distance, tension rippling through their ranks as they registered what had just happened between the two combatants. The young master reminded him calmly that a waiter-style duel had one simple rule. It ended the moment a fighter's weapon touched the ground, and Bessemer's axe now lay right there in the dirt. Among the stunned onlookers, one soldier could barely form the words, admitting under his breath that the boy had actually won. Disbelief rippled through the rest of the group as they rushed forward, repeating the same realization to each other, unable to fully process what they had just witnessed. One of the soldiers grabbed him by the hair, sneering and calling him a kid, only for the young master to correct him sharply, declaring his name for all of them to hear: Isaac von Goethe. Bessemer's voice roared over all of them, silencing the surrounding chatter with a furious demand for everyone to be quiet. The soldiers around Isaac stepped back as heavy footsteps closed in, Bessemer advancing on him with unmistakable hostility written across his face. He seized Isaac by the collar, snarling that no ordinary fighter could have turned the tide like that, demanding to know exactly what kind of trick had been used against him. Isaac stared back at him, unshaken, asking flatly whether Bessemer intended to reject his own defeat and asking if he was really willing to throw away a warrior's honor over it. Bessemer's fury only deepened. He spat back that it was Isaac who had defiled the sanctity of their duel and vowed that the insult would be washed away with his blood. From further down the path, more figures approached fast. One of them shouted furiously at the soldiers standing by, demanding to know why none of them had stepped in to stop what was happening. An older man among them, sharp-eyed behind his glasses, warned darkly that if Bessemer so much as laid a finger on the young master, there would be consequences. Anger flashed across the soldiers' faces as the threat landed, and the warning came down hard. Anyone standing there would be executed for treason if harm came to Isaac. Chaos broke out among Bessemer's men as several soldiers grabbed hold of him, one shouting for him to snap out of it. Another accused him of being a lunatic bent on getting all of them killed. Isaac struggled against the grip holding him back, demanding to be released. Bessemer's face twisted with restrained fury, sweat running down his brow as his men held him back with force. He shouted again, louder this time, repeating his demand for them to let go of him immediately. Later that night, under a sky scattered with stars, a voice broke the silence, asking why he hadn't been told about the plan beforehand. Isaac sat on his bed, sword across his lap, explaining calmly that he needed both his companion and Hans to react convincingly so Bessemer would take the bait and underestimate him. Schiller's response came flat and disbelieving. Schiller pressed a hand to his forehead, visibly overwhelmed, asking since when Isaac had been capable of something like this. He looked at Isaac directly, connecting the pieces, pointing to the strange magic he had witnessed ever since the mana explosion some time before. Schiller asked directly why Isaac hadn't told them the truth from the start. Isaac's answer was simple. Schiller already knew the reason, since his own condition closely resembled that of someone from a century past. Schiller stiffened, calling it the manifestation of his bloodline, before adding that his father would never have allowed Isaac access to the records of past generations. Isaac's expression turned distant as he admitted that given how dire his condition had been, he hadn't cared about permission. He had gone through those records in secret. He continued, explaining that if word ever spread that he could use magic, no one in the kingdom would accept it, and asked Schiller to keep the secret buried along with him. Schiller's eyes narrowed with unease as a single question formed in his mind. Was magic truly the only thing Isaac was hiding from everyone around him? In a quiet hallway lit by pale moonlight, a sharp-eyed man in formal attire lingered near a doorway, watching something unfold just out of sight. Inside the room, a woman knelt gently beside a bed, tending to a small child while a tall figure stood close behind her, watching in silence. The boy on the bed slept peacefully, his breath visible in the cold air, unaware of everything unfolding around him. Time had passed since then, and Isaac knelt now with sword in hand, a quiet realization settling in that, at some point, without him fully noticing, he had become an entirely different person. He tightened his grip around the blade, murmuring a single word of agreement to himself, steady and resolved. Isaac turned to Schiller and told him he needed to ask a favor. Schiller straightened, asking carefully what kind of favor it could be. Schiller studied him closely, piecing something together on his own, noting that the recent duel had effectively handed Isaac command authority over Winfeld. Isaac's gaze sharpened, calm and certain, as he declared that the time had finally come for him to begin acting as Lord in earnest. Snow settled quietly over the fortified outpost, as lanterns flickered along the walls, the watchtower standing guard over rows of tents where soldiers rested before the coming conflict.